We are on time thanks to Aleksandra, so thank you. Yes, I know, you're awesome. There's no question about it. There we go. And for Leo, I'm just making sure I get you all set up here, my friend. And I'm just going to check with Stephanie before I go any further. Stephanie, are we seeing his slides? Yes, thank you. Given our technical fun this morning, I thought I'd make sure Leo we can see everything, right? Our technical expert actually is nearby. Yes. Sorry. See, this is why I actually have colleagues know what they're doing. We'll get it away. All right, thank you, sir. All right, Leo. I've known Leo forever. Seems like it actually from there. I always like to make sure I get this sort of introductions right. However, nonetheless, if you know somebody for a long time, Leo is ecologist team leader 1 at Rouge National Urban Park. I always try to reverse those words, actually. I've known you for a whole pile of different projects, all of them wonderful. So I was really pleased to have Leo here today, actually, for bringing us. I say this to other people, so your ears may burn, actually, but he's one of the most innovative scientists that I've never known. You have such really great ways of doing it. Communication strategies. I would like to be you someday is what I would like to do. So he is going to talk today on promoting human-wildlife coexistence as a driver of landscape conservation in Rouge National Urban Park. And without further ado, and without making his ears burn further, I turn it over to you, sir.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Steve and University of Waterloo for the invite. A little bit about me. I am former biologist, ecologist from the National University of Mexico. I did my PhD at McGill University, not from Guelph, not from Waterloo, but very, very happy to be part of the academic community also in Ontario and Montreal. And I've been with the Parks Canada agency for 16 years. So I'm, as Steve say, a little bit getting old, but very happy to be here and to share with you some of the work that we do at in Parks Canada. We're going to go around the purpose of this meeting, which is basically achieving those conservation targets that that Steve was originally curious about by organizing this meeting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the role of protected areas in this global picture of conservation. And also a key word that I want you guys to have after this meeting is the evidence base that we need to make decisions. And so we're going to talk about that all along my presentation. And then we will go with a little bit of more detail to the area of human-wildlife coexistence, which is one of the projects that I am leading at the Rouge. We call it just the Rouge National Urban Park, or RNUP. And then we will present 2 cases of human-wildlife coexistence just to to give an example of with more detail about what actually entails doing conservation. When you think about it, actually, when you say, how are you actually doing conservation? Just by observing, monitoring, or by managing, or everything together. So we will talk a little bit about that, and then we will just finalize with some final reflections. This is a composed image of North America at night that illustrates well but the concentration of the human footprint around the largest cities of North America. But also at the same time, we can see in the northern areas this darkness, which is representative of extensive natural areas, like, for example, the boreal forests, the permafrost, numerous lakes and rivers that make Canada important, not only for us as a Canadian, but for the whole planet. It is every time more clear about the planetary importance of these big, larger landscapes in the planet. After these wildfire seasons, whatever is happening in the north, now we actually can feel it, we can smell it. So looking at this map, make us to think about what is our human footprint? What are the real conservation possibilities that we have in a country like Canada, where we have still these extensive landscapes that are doing well, I would say, but still under pressures of landscape transformation. Parks Canada has been an old system of managing protected areas. We are 112 years old. And we are the world's first national park service in the planet. Many countries use protected areas as the core of their programs to preserve biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services. And Parks Canada has played a role in helping Canadians safeguard biodiversity and cultural heritage places through the establishment of protected areas, but also importantly about presenting these natural treasures to Canadians. At this time, I'd like to ask you for raising your hand if you have been in a national park. That's amazing. Well, this speaks well about the work we are doing. Basically, we are actually outreaching a lot of people. And as you can see in the next slide, this is the projection of the national park system. So we are basically covering more or less 80% or more of all the natural regions of the country. We still need to finalize and cover the whole thing, but we are still very well extensively covering most of the ecosystems in Canada. And as you can see, in the north of the country, the largest reserves, comparing to the small ones in the south, where we see Point Pelee National Park, the Rouge, where I am coming from to present to you, and all the parks in the Atlantic coast, we can actually see just dots. They are so small, so fragmented, and embedded between cities and people, literally. And this is taking us to think about what is the access that all these urban communities have to this large system of protected areas, if most of them are so distant. I recently went to Jasper National Park, and it took me like a day just to get there. So pretty distant places, actually. So how can we actually share our message to the majority of Canadians if most of the national parks are remote? Again, the learning of 100 or more years of Parks Canada has taken us to think about if people is not possible to actually go to those distant places, we are going to build a national park close to one of the biggest cities of the country, in Toronto. Rouge National Urban Park is an historical achievement, a new type of protected area never seen in Canada. It has a remarkable biodiversity. We feel comfortable with a number of 2,000 species, but we have seen recent databases, and the numbers are close to 4,000. The park is going to be about 80 kilometers squares of area, and it's going to be covering a good part of the east end of the GTA. It's important to mention, as many of the natural protected areas of the country, they have this ancient history of indigenous peoples' presence. So we always keep in mind these ancestral people and connections with the land. Importantly as well is farmers. We are protecting also agriculture in the Rouge. And we have farmers of 2-3 generations that they've been in the park farming, and we are also protecting farmland from development. The park, as you can see here, is basically achieving the vision of connecting the waters all along the tributaries of the Rouge from the Oak Ridge Moraines to the Lake Ontario. This was one of the main visions that we have in the park. And as we are building and establishing the park and the trail system, we can see now how species are actually flowing from north to south, and then just achieving different areas where never seen wildlife before. We have recently seen black bears, even moose in the park, just in the middle of Markham in the city of Toronto. Importantly, for the purpose of this presentation, when we talk about this biodiversity, this wildlife that is now moving and is finding home at the Rouge, you can see in the map all these squares. These are roads. We are one of the parks with the highest density of roads. We have the old system of concession roads, which is basically a grid. If an animal is found in one of those patches, in any direction this animal goes, it's going to find a road. The park is highly dissected by roads, and because of that, wildlife can be impacted drastically. However, there is a connection from the park to the Oak Ridge Moraine, where there is more natural areas. So the wildlife is actually facing different gradients of disturbance and pressures from the north, more rural areas, to the south, where we have the city of Toronto, Markham, and the highest visitation. So how do we coexist with the wildlife in a setting like a big city, should we ask? This is not new. Basically, humans, we have evolved by living and sharing the space with wildlife. Probably the ancient humans were basically just trying to survive and kill wildlife, or being killed by wildlife. So coexistence has been a long story of human survival and wildlife survival at the same time. But we have mastered these relationships, right? By transforming those environments where these species thrive and live. So there is a point currently where we are basically overimposing and pushing wildlife to small little corners, and then coexistence is becoming more tougher, more difficult to wildlife, right? As these spaces get smaller, squish, so wildlife is going to be more abundant and aggressive, or it's going to be, populations getting to lower numbers, depletion. You can see in this little cube this model of interactions where human-wildlife coexistence exists. Basically, you can have an elephant destroying your house in Africa. If you are in an area with sharks, you can actually, you're not going to have probably a good interaction with a shark. So interactions between humans and wildlife are depending of the species, are depending of the time, or the abundance, the context where this is happening. So not everything is about killing or being eaten. There is a gradient of situations, very dynamic, right? Is for the agency, the desired outcome of our actions to prevent, and I say prevent and manage conflict between people and wildlife. It means the survival and well-being of wildlife and people in the same space, in the same spaces, same spaces. We should share and use the landscape together. Parks Canada protected places should be models of human-wildlife coexistence. This is a recent publication from the WWF, which basically is just picturing how the areas of overlap between human-dominated areas and land shared by people. The more areas we have shared with wildlife, the more possibility we have to have this type of incidents and conflicts may arise. Most of the drivers, as we may know, human population dynamics, land use change, this is going to create pressures on the ecosystem just by losing and fragmenting the habitats. It can be also blocking connectivity, invasive species, you name it. The impacts in this particular publication, they speak about mostly material damage, like crop damage, property damage, livestock damage, etc. In general, these type of impacts are the ones that we want to mitigate by understanding the sources of the conflict. One of my main examples that we are working on is how wildlife can actually persist in a urban environment where the abundance and density of roads is as such as in the Rouge. This is a picture that was taken close to the winter of 2021. And usually we get beavers roadkill. However, this beaver was actually building a beaver cache, which is just getting supply for the winter. But the beaver was actively actually using the other side of the road to chew the vegetation and coming back to the other side of the road. So for a full day or two, the beaver was basically just crossing the road with these big logs. If this wouldn't happen, the beaver would have been killed. But because the beaver was actually carrying these logs, drivers were actually more careful about hitting the beavers. They can actually get impacted badly. Even there was observations from this photographer that one of the cars was actually almost just losing control by steering away from this beaver. So that speaks about how these interactions on the roads can happen and how the dynamics of these interactions can be also different. In the particular case of the beaver, we are talking about these different drivers and pressures, and basically the linear infrastructure impacting the habitat loss, fragmentation, and potential property damage and public safety. There has been a lot of attention on this area of wildlife on the roads, which is the area of road ecology. Basically, when you see roads, you are losing wildlife habitat right there. Road mortality is happening. There is a barrier. Some animals are not going to actually cross it. There are some animals, there is some research actually from the University of Waterloo with milk snakes that demonstrated that the milk snakes were actually avoiding crossing the roads. There is decrease in the habitat quality. There is disturbance and pollution you're not going to believe the amount of salt that exists on the roads during the winter times. And of course, there is a lot of situations happening along the edges, the roadsides of the roads. This is a clear example on the left of how animals can be actually considered trapped in between roads, which might be the case of the Rouge in this grid of roads and systems. This is some of the data that we have collected. These are just casual observations for 2021 that show some of the hotspots where we can see high number of incidents that have arise from road interactions, vehicles and wildlife. Since 2010 to 2021, we have consistently monitored a couple of areas that are important in terms of biodiversity. And by using standard methodologies, we have been able to identify what is called hotspots for roadkill. One of the most famous areas in the park is the intersection of Finch Avenue and the Scarborough town line. This is a very important intersection because this is where we have one of the largest ponds and wetlands in the park. So unfortunately, there's been a couple of thousands of animals along this period of time that have been impacted in this area. Some of the mitigations that we have been using, as you may know, is fencing and eco passages. There is some work that has mentioned that fencing may be sufficient just to avoid animals to cross. But what we have found in this particular case, by studying pre and post fence installation and a culvert that allowed wildlife to actually move through and avoid the road, we found significantly less incidents in this particular intersection by merging these two approaches of fencing and box culverts for wildlife passages. Next year, we're going to be installing one of the eco tunnels that are designed for small animals. Amphibians, reptiles are going to be in a better shape there. One of the questions that emerged when thinking about these mitigation practices, where can we continue doing these installations? Do we need to do hotspot analysis across all the roads in the park? What we have found based on observations navigating across the park and recent hotspot analysis just in other locations is that the wildlife is using most of these water courses, corridors, creeks, ditches, tributaries, where they intersect with the roads. So we're going to try to be more proactive in the future and avoid collecting numerous data that is going to tell us, okay, this is a hotspot, we have a lot of roadkill. And we're going to be more proactive and start actually fencing those areas where we believe animals naturally are moving through. Another important aspect on road ecology and promoting human-wildlife coexistence is education, is communication. We were part of an initiative in Parks Canada that was called Making Roads Safer for Wildlife. And we had one expert just dedicated to study behavior, drivers' behavior, how drivers behave by interacting with different signs that are on the roads. And one of the propositions, or one of the most successful approaches on road signs is actually make a little bit more personal contact with the drivers. The typical diamond, yellow diamond with a turtle just right there, very static, people is just forgetting about it. What we are using, or we were using at this particular intersection, is thinking about an action that we are asking the people. A turtle, I am slow. give me a break. People love it. Actually, the design was now exported to another national park and another reserve. And we have a lot of likes and Facebooks and sharings and everything. And this wouldn't happen without the partnering of the municipalities. So this is another important message. Partnering, we cannot do everything by ourselves. So partnering is super key when working on roads. One action that is important that one of our team members have been leading, Jody Mullen from the Rouge, is establishing a wildlife emergency response teams. As we are not able to actually fence the whole park at this point, what my colleague is doing is basically assisting, caring for wildlife that unfortunately is impacted by vehicles. So now we have a team that is responding to any wildlife emergencies in the park, and they are certified people that can actually provide medicine and care to animals. Now every fleet vehicle in the park has a box ready to carry animals, gloves to protect yourselves when manipulating the animals, the basic medicine, protection, etc. And then we take them to the animal centers. So these are some of the actions that we've been taking for the road ecology work. And there is some technology that I always like to actually think about it. I always think that if we are able to actually travel to the moon, we can do something here to help wildlife. This is a virtual fencing that now is not actually the plastic green fence that I showed you before. It's an invention from Australia. And basically, it's a sensor, as you can see in the picture, that when it detects a wildlife of medium size, big size, and a car at the same time, is producing a sound and a light that immediately is deterring wildlife from crossing the road. So this is actually been working and been testing in Australia. We are curious about it. Maybe can be an option for us at the Rouge. Maybe. Australia doesn't have the winters that we have, right? So we'll see. But interesting to think about it. So we've been doing a lot of work on this. Partnering is important. Technology is important to think about that. Sharing with the public, with the students, and hopefully we can achieve some level of public safety and wildlife protection on the roads of the park. My second case is going to be talking about beavers. How can we actually coexist with animals that have been prosecuted for a long time ago, almost to the own extinction of the species? Why beavers were persecuted so badly? First of all, it was for the fur trade. The animals were basically just almost extirpated from most of North America. Now that beavers are coming back, thinking about those interactions that I mentioned to you, for most of the people, beaver is a problem. It's a nuisance wildlife that is going to be flooding probably my backyard, is going to be chewing my trees, and in general, it is a species that is causing conflict, and we are trying to understand how we can mitigate those conflicts in a national park, where our mandate is to protect these species and coexist with them. Again, land use, habitat loss and fragmentation, property damage is here. Importantly, wildlife behavior. Why beavers build dams? There has been some research about it. Beavers, people that have grown beavers, and actually beavers can actually automatically start actually building dams with garbage, with toys, with whatever they found around. It is a behavior that is embedded in these animals just to coexist, just to create those ponds that are important for survival. So we have an important and interesting behavior here that is part of the question of human-wildlife coexistence. We have identified, as you can see in the map, 7 or 8 beaver dams, well established, some in the beach area, some in the Finch Avenue and Scarborough, where we have these eco passages. Actually, the beavers are using the eco passage to avoid using the road and one of the corners of the area. And then we have more beavers in the northern areas where we have one big tributary, the Dauphin's Creek, that is coming down into the park. We believe that a good population of beavers, a good number of beavers are coming from these north areas where there is another system important of meadows and wetlands created by beavers. The pictures in the center are telling us how the beavers start building this dam. In this particular case, under a bridge. You can see how they basically, in a day or two, they can basically block the whole bridge, and then flooding start happening almost immediately. And then in the particular case of 2099 Concession Road, that drive lane was flooded. So this is an important transportation lane for the farmer community in the park. So we need to be certain that, that the beavers in this area are not flooding this particular spot. How these animals are actually promoting habitat change in a national park. You can see one of the beaver dams at my right. These are really amazing structures. They are very strong. You can actually walk over them. Bears, coyotes, we have seen in our cameras. We are monitoring all these areas, and we can see how these beaver dams are actually increasing land connectivity for terrestrial animals. And there are records that also for indigenous peoples in the past, beaver dams were an important element just for connecting, you know, these long journeys across the landscapes. Our cameras are telling us biodiversity is increasing in these areas. Animals that have never been there before. If you think about the farmland that I mentioned to you in the northern areas of the park, suddenly having ponds and wetlands, we have seen amazing amount of waterfowl in these areas, frogs, and other species that are just flourishing in these areas. This is an example that just struck me yesterday when I was thinking about this. What are the landscape impacts of beavers in the landscape? You can see on the upper right, on my right, one of the largest beavers meadows in North America. This is Colorado Rocky Mountain National Park. Can you see the texture of the meadows and the rivers? And then in my left, this is one beaver meadow river system in the Rouge. They look almost the same. We have more or less similar landscape processes happening just 20 minutes drive from one of the biggest cities of the country. Whereas in Colorado, in one of the biggest national parks, something very similar is happening. However, as I mentioned, in the case of the bridge, there are areas where we need to prevent beavers for actually creating those ponds. There are some tools, some techniques that we use. We can use some notching, which is basically making some perforations to the beaver dam and to reduce the water flow. But you can spend all your life there because beavers, the same day or after you go, they are gonna come back and close the hole. So you better be wiser than the beavers, and then you put a fence. The fence that you can see there is a fence that is designed for beavers. If they are willing an adventure to actually try to build another beaver dam, they're not gonna do it. They are never gonna end because it has now 3 different sites, large areas. They are gonna just give up. And there is one pipe system that we are gonna be installing this year, which basically allows water to flow. So we need to calculate the water flow, the water amount that is in the watershed, in the tributary, and then you design the diameter of the pipe. And then you install a proper system. It can be one, it can be two of these pipe systems that will allow basically water flow through the dams. You locate the pipe across the beaver dam, and the beavers won't be able to actually dam anywhere. So water will continue flowing. The pond for the beaver will continue a good level, and we will minimize the conflict right there. We were doing some TV show filming this year with the TVO episode for TVO Kids. The TV show is called The Architect. So it was a little bit intimidating, just being in front of these cameras with all these people. But we were, our interest, again, goes back to working with the people, educating, showcasing. We spent a full day just talking about the beavers, the starring wonderful kid. We were basically building beaver dams in the river and talking about what is the importance of those piles of wood. What is the impacts? An author calls the beaver dam an epicenter of landscape change. Once you have one beaver dam, the whole thing is going to start changing almost magically. So it's very interesting when talking to kids about beavers and how they can actually be more acceptable of beaver presence. There is a lot of recent literature about the importance of beaver for climate change, even for wildfire prevention or mitigation, flow regulation, climate regulation, etc. So there is no more I can tell you about the importance of beavers to keep them in the landscape and make the best efforts to coexist with them. It's been a long learning process working with beavers. You never know, it's very unpredictable. We put a fence in the northern side of the bridge because we were told that the beavers are going to be building the dams facing north of the water. So we built the fence in the north side of the bridge, and the beaver just built the dam in the south side of the bridge. So they are pretty smart, and you have to be constantly adapting your technology and to cope with them. Keeping beaver in the landscape where the levels of risk are acceptable results in a good environmental investment for biodiversity increases, climate regulation, water filtration, landscape connectivity for aquatic and terrestrial species, and also mitigate wildland fires. My final thoughts to share with you is we're doing a national level effort for human wildlife coexistence across the country, across the Parks Canada system. And Parks Canada has formed teams of experts dedicated to managing and promoting human wildlife coexistence in national parks. Jasper National Park has at least a crew of 20 staff every year because of the bear season. So the investment is big, and we are doing a really good effort to train our staff on managing conflicts for coexistence. We have developed an incident event management system, which is a national level platform that allows us to report and to share information across the country where we can actually learn from each other and don't invent the wheel again. By properly understanding how the conflicts may present, the more effective our mitigations are going to be. This is the summary of our Parks Canada Human Wildlife Coexistence template, where we can see what is happening across the country and we can learn from each other, as I mentioned. The examples that I presented at this point have the potential to contribute to wildlife protection, public safety, habitat creation, biodiversity increase, and landscape connectivity. New tools and technology are available to study and mitigate conflicts, but all of this is changing so rapidly. Human-wildlife coexistence operations in the face of climate change should include strategies for adaptation and resilience. When, for example, now more heavy rains or wildland fires could increase unacceptable risk and reduce people's tolerance. As you can see, everything is so dynamic. We may be good today, or we don't know what will happen in a month or in a year. And with that, I just like to acknowledge all the partners that have been working with us, the Toronto Zoo, EcoCare International, the Liber Institute, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and the Ontario Road Ecology Network. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Beautiful two opening talks. Thank you very much. Now, do we have any questions for Leo?
One of our online participants at Maury's actually share an anecdote that their wildlife cameras also suggest that beaver dams are an important connectivity feature in natural areas, and is wondering if there's maybe a need for new science or publication around that. Oh, sorry. So there's an anecdote that cameras are also providing evidence that beaver dams can improve connectivity in natural areas. And Ed Morris is wondering if there's a need for new science or publication around that.
I'm not sure if I understand correctly the question, but yeah, we have cameras in each of the locations. Is that the question? The importance of the cameras?
And documenting this effect in connectivity.
Well, what we have seen in the cameras, we have thousands of pictures, and we have seen a lot of wildlife using the beaver dams for crossing. So yeah, we can quantify that, and it's in our project to do use the Wild Tracks platform to start developing an algorithm that can allow. Sometimes the pictures are tricky, you know, wildlife cameras. You can see sometimes a shade, it's not clear, etc. So we will be developing this algorithm with Wild Tracks to actually start identifying which animals are using those areas and start quantifying.
Thank you.
Anything else, Leo?
Is that too loud? Oh, that's good. So in 2015, I worked with the ROM and we went to the Rouge National Park to do a huge BioBlitz with the community. Do you guys still keep that up to update your species biodiversity data?
Yeah, well, the question coming is about the 2015 BioBlitz and if we will be updating our biodiversity kind of data. Is that correct?
Yeah. And if there's any future BioBlitz events that Rouge is planning.
Yeah, that BioBlitz, I was actually there. Oh. And I think probably, I don't know if we met there, but yeah, the BioBlitz are amazing. They are a good source. I think there was a new spider or a new insect discovered.
I think it was an insect because I was part of the insect group and there was some finding. Yeah, so that's ringing a bell actually, yeah. Yes,
so it is challenging to actually get to the list as per now can be close to 4,000 species. And the BioBlitz, I have no update if they are going to continue, but I'm totally supportive of that for sure.
Cool. Yeah, maybe we'll work in the future to update it with the ROM and stuff. Yeah, that sounds good.
Leo, thank you very much. Aleksandra, the same actually this morning, and apologize for our slight technical glitch to get us a little bit delayed, but we are on time thanks to the efficiency of our speakers and audience. For the Zoom audience, you're about to see me stop sharing screen. I will probably just turn the video off and obviously the audio too. We are going to, I think, initiate our solution for making sure that the next speaker, Courtney Robichaud, who I've been in contact by text, thank you, Courtney, is able to be heard in the room. We don't have a problem on the Zoom side of it. So we'll be able to do that. We got about a half an hour break. I probably will start about 5 after 11, not very later, obviously, but just give us still a little bit of a time. So for those of you on Zoom, you've got about half an hour. We do have a slide which will stand by. I'm just going to actually ensure we sort of focus on the audio solutions. So all of you on Zoom will see a blank. I'll remind people when we're coming in about 5 minutes beforehand, that we're reconvening. Thank you very much, Leo and Aleksandra. Thank you to the Zoom audience and the audience here. For the audience here, we have refreshments. For the audience at home, you have to get your own refreshments. Sorry about that, actually. Thank you. And well, sure, Courtney actually is joining us, actually. She and I are on text right now. I am actually pleased to introduce Courtney. She is a postdoctoral scholar at Carleton University, where she's a Liber Ero Fellow. Now, for those of you who don't know academia, that is actually one of the biggest and most prestigious awards you can get. I wouldn't have been worthy of it. Courtney is. I've known Courtney for a long time, and she says on her website, I'm going to add a few sort of embellishments there. She is definitely sort of an awesome conservation and ecological scientist. She's been a graduate here of my own unit, School of Environment Resources and Sustainability, and the Department of Biology, where she did graduate work. Now, Dr. Robichaud has been a leader in support our science. And for those of you who haven't seen that, there are lots of sort of places that I can take you. I'll probably put something in the comments eventually in the concluding part of this sort of session, where you can actually see where that is. And essentially what they're setting out to do with Courtney's help, of course, and leadership is to right the wrong of about 15 years of drastic underfunding of academia in this sort of world of ours in Canada. And that is especially focused, and rightly so, on the support of graduate students and of postdoctoral fellows. Extremely impressive, extremely impressive. Dr. Robichaud is going to talk about embracing uncertainty, knowledge, community, and advocacy and conservation. And I will call upon our colleague actually to get her going, if you wouldn't mind. So Courtney will get you in a minute. Those on Zoom, you should see this momentarily.
Let me know when you're ready for me and if everything's looking good.
In your slides, you okay? And we're seeing everything actually. So Courtney, we appear to have you online here. You can take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve, for that kind introduction. And as Steve said, this is kind of exciting to be back virtually at the University of Waterloo, where I started my undergrad. And I remember in my first year of showing up as a 17-year-old on campus and taking Steve's course about ecological restoration and being like, ooh, that sounds really interesting to me. And I did my undergrad thesis with Steve on wetland restoration in the region. And he was the first person who made me think like, maybe I could really do this science thing. And I sort of tripped over to the biology department where I worked with Dr. Rebecca Rooney for the better part of a decade, really. When I first showed up in Waterloo, I didn't think I'd end up there as long as I did. But Rebecca and I worked together in Long Point and Rondo Provincial Park, you can see here, where a lot of my work was looking at how wetland communities responded to invasive species and invasive species management. And I finished my PhD in May 2021, and I've moved on to, I'm currently residing in Ottawa. I'm working at Carleton University with Dr. Joe Bennett, and I recently started a new relationship with the Healthy Headwaters Lab at the University of Windsor. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the work that I've been doing and the sort of trajectory that my research has been taking in the last few years, and how it can maybe help inform how we can translate all of our theory, our interesting science, and our ideas into actual practice and on-the-ground change. So as I mentioned, my previous research, mostly at the University of Waterloo, was looking at wetland restoration and invasive species. Now, the majority of my work took place in Long Point, Ontario, which is located on the north shore of Lake Erie. It's a really beautiful sandspit peninsula. It's a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve. It represents about 70% of the remaining intact coastal wetlands on that north shore of Lake Erie. It's a really, really beautiful place, and it has been since around the late 90s invaded by invasive Phragmites australis. I'm not going to go into Phragmites too much today, but this really changed the landscape of that system, which led to, in 2016, a really collaborative effort to control this invasive species with the federal, the provincial government, and a bunch of NGOs like Ducks Unlimited Canada, Nature Conservancy of Canada, and the University of Waterloo as sort of the research or science provider. So this work began in 2016 of trying to control Phragmites by using large-scale applications of glyphosate-based herbicide to control the plant. Herbicide is necessary because if you're not familiar with Phragmites, it is a grass. It's incredibly robust. If you are just trying to control that above ground biomass, it really is just going to keep thriving. So we need to use a herbicide that can be translocated into those perennial below ground rhizomes and actually begin to reduce the population. So this is just a little overview of the work that I did for 5 or 6 years, really, a master's and a PhD, where I looked at how wetland bird communities were responding to invasive Phragmites invasion. And then this moved into evaluating the herbicide in water and soil in the region, looking at how the vegetation responded using a before-after control impact design, looking at how the vegetation community recovered after treatment, how effective we were at reducing the population of Phragmites. And then because I am at heart a community ecologist, I'm very interested in systems and how when we pull on one thread, what changes along a different pathway. I also wanted to see when we change that vegetation, how does that affect the aquatic invertebrates? And then how in turn does a potential change in emerging aquatic invertebrates change prey quality and quantity for aerial insectivore birds such as barn swallows here. So a lot of this work I did was in direct partnership with those practitioners on the ground. And it meant that my work was often messy. So I couldn't do, beautiful randomized experiments because we were working right alongside the practitioners where they were applying. And I would sometimes get feedback from reviewers about, why didn't you randomize these sites better? And I was like, well, they're not going to just randomly spray around this area to benefit me and my experimental design. But it also meant that my work was directly informing this on the ground process each year. So in addition to writing peer-reviewed articles, it was writing reports, it was presenting, it was sharing with the NGOs and the government agencies, and we were sort of adapting each year and integrating this research into it. And it was a really, it became really my favorite way to do science. Like I love doing science and I love doing it in close collaboration with people where we could see, okay, the science is directly informing what we're doing on the ground, what's happening on the ground. Let's start changing how we're monitoring, adapting it this way. So the theme of the conference today was sort of, I thought, really beautifully encaptured where my career and my interests have kind of been developing, which is trying to think about that transition from our concepts and our science to actual on the ground action. And in these kind of early years of my postdoc, I set out to do this national survey of conservation practitioners. So social science, I've somehow become, or I'm doing a bit of social science, not that I am. I have wonderful colleagues like Christine Baudouin, for example, at Carleton University, and others at Carleton University who've really helped me in the actual application of how to do this work. But because of my experiences, my interests are really in what drives people to do this work in conservation and what maybe limits our ability to do the work we want to do in the way we'd like to do it. And I think all of us in this field are particularly interesting because no matter the route we've taken or the sort of approach that we take, we're all driven by this like innate spark to see the world be different, to see the world be better, to see the world value nature and non-human beings and the land and water and air in a way that we value, money and other resources. And I think that's really fascinating to start diving into. So it's kind of zooming out in a systems approach of what's guiding us, what maybe makes us, what limits us, what drives us. So over the last year, I have been running a survey titled Uncertainty in Conservation Decision Making. And this closed back in May. And we wanted to identify the prevalence and impact of uncertainty on decisions that affect biodiversity in Canada. So what this meant was we had a short online survey. It was took about 10-15 minutes to complete. And to participate in the study, we had a pretty broad eligibility criteria. You had to be currently working with a conservation agency in Canada, so doing some sort of on-the-ground conservation work, and you had to be at least 18 years old. And we spread this all around the country. We used what's called a snowball recruitment technique, which is just me, if I knew you or I was Googling your organization, I creeped a bunch of people and then I sent them these invitations and said, please send them to everyone you know. I really want to hear from all of you. And we had something like 400 people start the survey and about 170, 180 people complete the survey from start to finish, which is wonderful. And to give you an idea of our respondents, we have people who worked literally across the entire country. People could select that they worked more in one location. Our question was, where does your work take place? But you can see we have people in every province and every territory represented here. And when we asked folks, where do they work, you can get an idea of our respondent pool. We had a lot of responses from non-government agencies. So for example, like Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservancy Canada, we had a lot of land trusts, provincial, territorial government, federal government. And most of these respondents, we also asked them how long they had been in their current role. They've been in their role for over 5 years, with a lot of them having been more senior, been in that role for 10 years or more. And when we're asking about uncertainty, we're asking just sort of your ability to confidently make a decision. So we defined it and then we allowed people to sort of interpret that throughout as they will. So the first question that we asked them was an open-ended question. We said, thinking about the decisions that you make about conservation in your professional capacity, what are the major sources of uncertainty that you experience? And this question was 5 open-ended text boxes. You didn't have to fill in all 5. You could do 1, you could do 5. And then we asked people to rank those, with 1 being your highest source of uncertainty and 5 being your lowest source of uncertainty. And then we read through all of those open-ended answers and used an inductive coding approach. So we started to derive common codes from all of that open-ended data. And then those codes were grouped into broader themes, so each one. And what I'm showing you in this figure here are those broader themes of sources of uncertainty for conservation practitioners across Canada. The dark blue is ranked 1 and the orange is ranked 5. So dark blue is how often people said this was the largest source of uncertainty for me when I'm making decisions. And you can see here we have data or knowledge, I like to think of. So that's the actual information that they might have access to. Resources, I'm going to break these down as we go, but resources here, things like funding, things like personnel, capacity, governance. Governance was a lot of political will, the internal organization, or the internal structure of the organization. Evidence, so this would be using the actual practice of using data or knowledge or evidence. This also incorporated like scientific articles and things like that. Public support, so this might be landowner access, this might be just sort of public perception of what you're doing in general. Social complexity incorporated a lot of things about will people support what I'm doing? How does the complex sort of economic, ecological, social relationships. Ecological complexity, these were a lot of questions about climate change. How can I make decisions about, how can I make decisions when I'm not sure how climate change will be affecting us 5, 10, 15 years in the future? Other things just like weather or nature in general, just the complexity of nature and ecology. And then we had our sort of other grouping. And respondents could, their answers could contain more than one code, just as we're going along here, but most of them, because we asked them to fill in each box, they were sort of nicely, concisely, each one represented a sort of one code or one theme. So I'm going to focus on breaking down these sort of top 4 sources of uncertainty. So you can see that data, knowledge, resources, and governance in particular were a very high source of uncertainty, ranked both first and second for most people, and evidence was more often ranked as like a 3rd source of uncertainty. So data and knowledge, again, we're thinking about empirical data, information, knowledge gaps, understanding. And what I'm going to do is like walk you through each theme, breaking it down into the code and showing you a few examples of comments that people left to give you an idea of the flavor of the data we're working with and what many of your colleagues might be, or maybe even you, if you answered it, might be thinking about these sources of uncertainty when we're making conservation decisions. So this first theme of data or knowledge, a lot of people did just write data, maybe without additional explanation. They said there's not enough data, insufficient data. I'm worried about the sample size of my data. But some people did get more specific about the data and knowledge that they wish they had, or they felt there was an absence of, or it just limited their ability to make a decision with certainty. And this could be species data, like an absence of local data on species populations numbers. Insufficient data to resolve key questions in the decision-making process. So people might also not have enough information about specific methods they're interested in using, about the impact of a conservation decision or a disturbance. So we don't know enough about how this will impact our species of interest, our ecosystem of interest, or we don't have enough long-term data or site-specific data. Uncertainty about the impact that human activities are causing on the natural environment, as an example, or lack of definitive scientific proof for conservation action. So we don't have knowledge about how this method is going to actually improve conservation. When we get to resources, the #1 source of a lot of people's uncertainty around resources was funding in some capacity. This would be it could be funding without sort of elaboration. It could be the amount of funding, the sources of funding, the timelines of funding, just the reliability of funding, the fact that people cannot make long-term choices or long-term plans because the funding is maybe not always secure, always going to be coming in. So reliable sources of funding for the creation of new projects and the future monitoring of existing projects. Uncertainty about resources or capacity, so things like funding, things like staffing, things like personnel. Will we be able to sustain our actions or our programs? Even when funding is approved from certain sources, it doesn't show up in a timely manner. So there was a lot of comments about a mismatch between when funding shows up versus when your field season is actually starting and when you need that funding to be doing something on the ground in time. Things like timelines, often not aligning with the required time to produce quality data, quality program, quality outputs, and things like expertise, like we might not have the right expertise on our team and we're not sure how to get it or how to connect with science providers or others to actually make this work happen. And then our third most common source of uncertainty was what we called a theme of governance. And politics was the biggest one here. And this was often political will. So people making comments like political bias and its influence on conservation. Or I don't know what the priorities will be the next time the government changes over. So I can't make plans that are actually for the benefit of this ecosystem because it is subject to the whims of political will. political decisions regarding conservation that are based on social or political ideas versus actual scientific reasoning or based on actual evidence. Things like a lack of an ethical framework or approach for co-governance with Indigenous communities. This came up often of folks want to do better in terms of collaboration and co-management, but they might not have an actual pathway, or their organization hasn't clarified how this can happen, or they don't know how to start. Also things like internal support, like willingness. Do the people I'm working with believe in the action that I'm suggesting? And legislation. So legislation either not having enough teeth, or legislation being unclear about whose responsibility does this fall to, especially when you're working in a multi-jurisdictional issue. And evidence, which was again our top 4, but not as common as sort of data, knowledge, governance, and resources. We have evidence, and this fell under quite a few codes. But one that came up very often was people not having an idea of what success would actually look like in their role as a practitioner. So what would success actually look like? Or how do we actually implement this, even if it's a great idea? So uncertainty around the effectiveness of our actual management interventions. What would it look like if they succeed? What would it look like if they don't succeed and there's maybe no follow-up monitoring or no evaluation after a decision is made to actually see, was this better than an alternative? Or likewise, questions about, we have things here like prediction, so the ability to model or predict how variables will respond to an intervention. Some folks just said like the science in general. There were a lot of comments about cumulative impacts and things as well like consensus. So consensus as in conflicting science or opinions from researchers, but also consensus such as when people who are actually living on the ground, or knowledge from hunting and fishing guides, for example, in this comment, directly competes with scientific ideas. How do we handle when knowledge from the people we're working with who have lived experience competes with our theories or our scientific ideas? How do I move forward now? And a lack of understanding of the magnitude and effects of habitat change. So cumulative effects, as I mentioned, came up quite a lot. So this is just a small kind of slice of what practitioners are sort of contending with on the ground. And sometimes going into this survey, I was expecting a lot of the answers to be like data and knowledge and evidence-based. So I was not necessarily surprised, but it was very interesting that things like funding and governance came up as very, very high sources of uncertainty. And I've presented these as sort of distinct themes, and we've done that in terms of just creating these distinct themes for ease of analysis. But as we all know, these are all interrelated. The governance system you have influences the resources, the funding you have, which influences your ability to actually collect data, which then influences your ability to use that data. We know that each one of these, you pull on one thread and everything else sort of begins to change as well. So the last question I asked survey respondents was, what action or changes would reduce the degree of uncertainty that you experience in your decision-making process? So I wanted to get at what causes them uncertainty, but also what do they think would reduce that uncertainty? And this is a word cloud of the answers from a lot of respondents, and you can see the word fund is incredibly large. So for a lot of people, the solution, despite all of the a lot of people for their sources of uncertainty went very fine scale, very kind of nitty gritty about what their organization was doing. But when we asked what would be solutions for your uncertainty, a lot of people, the majority of our respondents said something about funding, something about resources, something about if you give me more resources, I can do my job better. And again, we did an approach here where reading through all of that data, we started to find similarities in the codes of what people were saying. And then we began to put these into broad themes for the answers of what would reduce your uncertainty. So I'm going to walk you through those broad themes with sort of the codes that emerged from them of what colleagues are saying would help improve conservation practices in Canada for them as people doing work on the ground. So resources, And you might remember from the other figure, resources, when we looked at that uncertainty, had a lot of things like personnel, capacity, timelines. Funding was a big one, but there were other sources. When we asked people what would reduce that uncertainty when it came to the resources theme, pretty much all of the answers were about funding. So improving the actual funding process, people saying, don't make me waste a lot of time applying for a small amount of money when I could be doing something else and it's not even a guarantee that I'll get it. Or better access to funding, make this easier, make this make the process so I have more autonomy with my budget and don't need to be reporting on every little thing. Longer term funding, we all know that restoration, conservation, the work we do exists on a very long timeline. So oftentimes the funding windows are too short for people to feel like they're making meaningful programs where we have some baseline data, we do an intervention, and then we are able to monitor effectively to see how an ecosystem is responding to that intervention. Funding for data, for evidence, for resources, secure, stable funding, non-specific. A lot of people just said, give me more funding. And I wanted to tie these sources of uncertainty into the ability to embrace what makes us uncertain and maybe think about how we can pull on these levers outside of our specific job description. And Steve he talked a bit about support our science and seeing these answers over the last year, when over the last year and a half, my official title now is Deputy Director of Support Our Science, but it really is a grassroots organization of just a few of us trying to change how much grad students and postdocs are paid at a federal level. And this really brought to mind kind of the lessons that I've been learning in this role, which is to say, improving funding processes and making these changes, it is not easy. So this is some photos from, this top photo is on May 1st, we had a national walkout across the entire country for Support Our Science in protest sort of Budget 2023 and this lack of increase in 20 years of the scholarships and postdocs and postdoc fellowships. So this photo is from Montreal at the top there. And then these two other photos of a meeting we had with Minister Champagne and a meeting with some of our team members with Minister Freeland. And these photos they're wonderful and they're flashy and they sort of are like, look at how much we've done, but they are 5 to 10% of the work of behind the scenes. It is just a few of us who are working a lot. And I was trying to think of like what advice I have from this experience for if you're feeling like you want to do something because you can see the threads of why, I don't have enough funding, so I can't do my job. And this is the reason why. There was a really perfect alchemy of the people who came together and those of us who do this work in terms of like our strengths and our perseverance. And I wouldn't recommend this to everyone. This has been like another full-time job. But one thing that I've learned in doing this work is that when you notice that, oh, this policy is impeding me for whatever reason, oftentimes the reason that it's still there is because no one thought to bring it up. One reason Support Our Science has been so effective at getting advocating at this federal level is because our mandate is very clear. We are for grad students and postdocs, and grad students and postdocs are often sort of not even a second thought, like a third or fourth thought. Like sometimes these things haven't increased in 20 years because no one thought of it. So I think my main takeaway is like, if you feel frustrated by these pieces, the main takeaway from the success that Support Our Science has been having is just be the squeaky wheel, be a little bit annoying. Sometimes these small policy tweaks are just because everyone's really busy, it slipped through the cracks. Sometimes you can start to change things. Come with your evidence, come with your reasoning, but it is like really within your grasp often to be able to start making at least small changes. So the other kind of themes around data and evidence were probably what all of us as scientists think about often when we're trying to make decisions, where we're saying we wish there were longer term data sets, wish there were more collaborative data sets across the country. Particularly, I think this was from respondents who were working within government organizations saying they wish there were more collaborative data sets or in general, a more standardized way that everyone's collecting the same data so we can share our data better. improve data sharing in general. So more open access data, more just more ease of sharing to make these decisions and using a larger database. Access to data, research, and evidence. This includes things like open access research. All of the papers that we publish that are behind paywalls, a lot of practitioners are saying, you know, it's not useful to us because we can't access it on our own. Using more evidence-based approaches and more acceptance and documentation of uncertainty. I had one respondent who said to me, or like responded in this and was like, well, there's no way to reduce my uncertainty. That's a pipe dream. I don't care about it. I just want to document the uncertainty a little bit more and still make choices. And I was like, all right, yeah, that's an excellent response. We also have this other theme of use of data and evidence. So seeing more evidence-based decision-making, having more clear decision support processes, addressing our biases when we come to using that evidence, when we come up to making those decisions. More follow-up and evaluation of these decisions. So maybe it took us a long time to actually make a choice. Is it built into the program that we're going to continue to follow up and see how that process worked? Can we improve on it? Can we kind of do adaptive management in these systems? And accepting that there will always be some risk. It will never be perfect. There will always be a trade-off. But accepting that risk and incentivizing conservation action. The idea of incentivizing action over inaction, not letting perfect be the enemy of good. And there was a lot of commentary on the quality of governance processes. So this was transparency and decision-making at every level, both within an organization where people worked, but also oftentimes at the political level, so a municipal, provincial, federal level, to understand why are these choices being made about our shared spaces. A lot of people said they like reduce political oversight or influence so that these changes in political whims don't completely derail what they're working on or what they had planned for a system. More in terms of leaderships and politicians, more of them really being able to understand evidence. So when you bring it to them, they know what you're talking about. And so that maybe there's less of a gap in translation between understanding the evidence and politicians understanding why they need to act on it. More accountability. So if the choices you've made are harming people, accountability in terms of how do we correct this? How do we go forward? Clarity around policies and legislation. So this kind of tied into a lot of similarly not having clear jurisdictions, clarity about what these policies are actually asking of folks in legislation. And one thing that was really interesting is you probably noticed that there were a lot of respondents from Ontario. And I think we had a lot of respondents in particular who in their responses have been dealing with the Ford government for at least the last sort of his 2 terms and continued kind of attack on conservation authorities, our land, our green belt, our wetland evaluation systems are key policies that allow us to actually protect land and in Ontario. And we're seeing this sort of across the entire country. But it really came out as like one of the top things that was impeding conservation practitioners in this country is political will, and political will sort of deciding the economy, is more important than these spaces. And I just pulled together, I assume everyone in the room is very familiar with these issues, but I pulled together some of the like grassroots organizing that's been happening, the mobilization against these omnibus bills, against these changes, to show that people are like, it's a really wonderful thing when people are stepping out and like standing up against these things. And I know sometimes as scientists, we think if I speak out against another MZO being used to develop this wetland, then I'm no longer unbiased. But just by the choice you've made in your career, you are not unbiased. That is the thing that you care about. And if we allow it to be paved or drained or destroyed, we can't get it back. And I think some of us, all of us also saw there are small wins, especially with this provincial government in Ontario. We can see if there's enough pushback. Sometimes we have some small wins, some temporary wins. I'm not one to be like, oh, we did it, it's over, but I'm like, this is good, this is responsive, this is us saying, no, we're standing up against this thing, and this is what it means on the ground to actually see restoration and conservation and stewardship in practice. I love supporting people who do this work on the ground, land defenders, people who are actually standing up and saying, no, you can't come here. This is what it means in practice. And there are a lot of themes around collaboration and engagement. So folks saying what they needed was improved public engagement and education, clearer communication in some way, either internally or externally with public support, clearer processes for communication and collaboration, so having an actual structure around that communication and collaboration, the science-politic collaboration, so doing my science in a way where I understand what policies, what levers I might want to be pulling, where I see the connection between the work that I'm doing and how governance decisions are made, and I'm working in collaboration here to make that have a bigger impact than it would on its own. Better internal communication and collaboration, better external communication and collaboration. And one thing that came up a lot, as I mentioned earlier, were folks who were interested in doing more Indigenous engagement, more engagement, for example, with the First Nations on whose lands they're working on. And I was lucky enough to spend the last 3 weeks doing this ethical space workshop that was put on by Compass Science Communication by Gwen Bridge, James Radlingleaf, and Sarah Sanu. And I would just be remiss if I didn't sort of plug this, at least for people who think that connects with them and they're interested in learning a bit more about how to do this. So these workshops are run and you can join them, or they can do one for your organization. But Gwen also has some wonderful sort of free resources on her website. And one of them that I highly recommend, that I found really clarifying as a Western trained scientist, was her explanation of this dual authoritative hierarchical framework. So when we're talking about an ethical space, you can kind of see that drawn between here of like the Western worldview on one side and sort of an Indigenous worldview on the other, with the caveat, this of course is not a pan-Indigenous approach. There's, differences within every community. But just the Gwen describing here of Earth-based observations on the Indigenous side carries an inherent authority. It carries legal weight, whereas Earth-based observations, the sort of the science that we do on the Western or dominant culture side, it carries no inherent legal authority. So we enter this policy validation feedback loop where when we're trying to do right, we're trying to incorporate things and do things well, we're drawing on Indigenous knowledge into these policy documents, for example. You're subjugating an entire body, an entire social legislative framework to a Western authority in which it has no authority here. So you enter this feedback loop where these observations are subject to things like budgetary constraints and consistency with other laws and jurisdictions and political wills and everything here that we saw about uncertainty. And it makes the risk of compromising Indigenous law really, really high. And this is a free, you can watch a sort of a short video that Gwen has available, but I think this resources can be really clarifying. She also has this sort of rapid assessment system that I think folks would benefit from in terms of your organization. If your organization, you're thinking about, we want to do this work better, but we feel stuck, this can be a great way to figure out where you are. And priorities, we have social political will, the will to act, clear goals and priorities, longer term actions, timelines, stable government priorities and long-term policies, conservation prioritized at all levels of decision-making, meaningful climate action, better, stronger conservation policies. And then we had a few external factors. We had people who said new technology would help us really, do new things. And then we had a few people who said, we need a socioeconomic revolution. We need to destabilize the rights of private property and things like that. They're thinking very big. So in summary, I just kind of wanted to talk about how identifying uncertainty is a really powerful tool to sit down and think about what limits my ability to maybe do work on the ground. And that maybe that uncertainty is a gift that can point you towards the change and the levers you're interested in pulling or pushing on. And I am lucky to be just starting a Liber Ero fellowship project with partners at the Healthy Headwaters Lab at the University of Windsor, where we're developing a community-based watershed monitoring program in the Great Lakes. which has been a real joy of thinking like, as a science provider, how do I fit into this? How can I be most effective? How, in working directly with the community, can I translate my science into things that are actually effective on the ground? By working in community and in relationship with people, we sort of remove that lag time of action, science action, which I think is really wonderful and exciting. And I just wanted to kind of end on a note of reflection of embracing uncertainty, which can direct our efforts beyond just our job description. Now, I'm not telling people to take on multiple jobs, but I'm saying when we think about the uncertainty that maybe impedes our ability to really make changes on the ground when it comes to conservation, we start thinking about the systems that drive the work that we do. And then we start thinking about, okay, then how maybe can we tweak that system? And so always, if you can come back to that reflection, that spark of wanting to change the world, what's the intention of the work that you're doing? What's the intention of the work we're doing as conservation practitioners? So I just wanted to thank everyone so much for your time and look forward to any questions if there is time for questions.
Yes, indeed, there are time for questions from the audience here or from Zoom. Again, Stephanie is monitoring the Zoom. Jason is at the ready, actually, the microphone for anybody in-house here. I get to ask one then. That's always nice to do. Courtney, that was a very thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. Thank you very much for that. One of the things that I was interested in sort of some of the responses, did you see, and I maybe then I had the same experience. Did you see people offering very specific solutions to some of the responses? I mean, you mentioned, for example, they would say data and that would be all they go. Did you see some of the elaborations in there? If you can share them, if they're confidential, then please ignore the question.
Yeah, some of the ones that were very specific do sort of like, we're a bit getting into, you could probably figure out who that person was, but
Sure.
a lot of the people who their uncertainty being very specific about like, we don't know enough about this one species in this one area, their solutions still ended up being fairly broad in terms of like changing the funding process or the governance process that would get us there. So people seem to be thinking, and a lot of people very generously broke their answers into like, in my role, here's what would reduce my uncertainty versus at a broader level society, here's what I think would reduce uncertainty.
Good, thank you. Anything else in the audience? Oh, there we go. We got one in the audience, please. Stephanie, do alert me if there's one online because I can't see it on my computer. So
Thank you. I was just curious, well, a couple questions, but from my own personal point of view, are you using in vivo for this coding? Or what software are you using for that?
Yeah, I actually was not using in vivo. I started using in vivo, but I'm just using Excel and R for the coding.
Cool. And I was
Yeah.
also curious, are the results of the survey going to be available kind of for practitioners and scientists to access and then draw upon, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm working on like writing all of this up right now, publishing it, and also probably trying to find a way to publish it that is not just in like potentially behind a paywall, peer-reviewed article. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
thank you. Other question over here, Jason? We're heading over for another one in person here.
1 second, I'm starstruck. I'm recovering. Oh yeah, here it is. Do you think it's possible to meet the changes that we need to have happen within the government and funding structures that we currently have? Or do you think it's possible to get what we need to get done within the systems currently in place? Or shall we just continue minorly tweaking them until they notice? Or should there be an overhaul?
I think I have like thoughts about this where I'm like, well, I don't know if I should say them in this form. I think that tweaks are wonderful. And I think one thing that I've been doing a bit more is trying to think about, okay, what if, when we think really creatively about, this is going to sound really random, but been reading papers like Emergent Strategy and Octavia Butler's work and thinking about okay, when we use fiction and science fiction to create a new world without the limits that we currently have, typically the limits of colonialism and capitalism and these things, how good could our world be, and what lessons can we learn from that to try and like instill them here? So I don't know if that answers your question of, I sort of try and dream really big without limitations, and then in my own day to day try and think about, okay, so how can I get closer to that in the systems that exist?
Thank you. That's really
It's a work in progress.
We have time for one more if anybody has one, and then we're going to adjourn for lunch for everybody. Seeing none, Courtney, I will appreciate very much actually all of your words in there. I found it actually also fascinating. You're talking about some of the things that came out of the survey in terms of the availability of evidence, being versus behind a paywall, something actually one of the groups I'm working with actually is also interested in. So I think we'll do a follow-up a little bit for email at least or something like that, because there's some interesting connections there as well, without, of course, hijacking the conversation.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Courtney. Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you very much, Leo, for the talks this morning. We are going to adjourn for lunch. For those of you on Zoom, we will be pausing the recording and, of course, pausing the meeting. We will reconvene at 1:45 as scheduled. And we'll start off with Jeff Bowman, and then we'll have Professor Deborah McGregor. She is up north, actually, and is coming in very remotely as well. So we'll see sort of how we go from there. But right now, actually, I think it's time for all of us to take a well-earned lunch break. For those of you here in person, please help yourselves, especially those of my students and other students around. We have, of course, got more than enough food, not ridiculous amounts, but enough for everybody. And for those of you sort of at home actually watching this, we hopefully will see most of you after the break. So thank you very much for this morning. We'll see you in about an hour. You. There we go. See, it's always good to have a real professional around, right? Thanks, man. For the afternoon session, we have two awesome speakers, as we had 3 this morning, and then we have a little exercise after the break where we ask you to indulge us, both online, if you will, and in the room, a little bit about sort of where you sort of see the state of research in parks going. So we'll talk a little bit about that sort of further on. Get a little bit of a device to help us out with, and we'll go from there. However, first I'm going to start with Jeff Bowman. Now, Dr. Jeff Bowman is, like all of other speakers, awesome. Yes, yes, yes. He's a scientist, research scientist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, also adjunct professor at Trent University. Lucky Trent University, actually. How do I describe it? Jeff has sort of the most amazing sort of list of publications that you could pour through and never finish because you want to learn 50 things in each publication. In fact, actually, you've caused me a few sleepless nights in the good sense because it's like, oh, I'm going to read this of Jeff's. And I'm not kidding. I mean, I do my restoration and rewilding course, actually. Lots of stuff in connectivity. A whole bunch of high quality papers. A bunch of sort of in there dealing with wildlife, advanced ecological analysis, spatial analysis. Also very much what I would consider translational ecologist, because Jeff's work actually sort of looks at the sort of cooperative and pragmatic ways that we can actually sort of have solutions, particularly in protected areas, but in any sort of system for that matter. So in the imagination, the design approaches, the whole implementation of landscape ecology, connectivity, sometimes more specifically, wildlife, it's all there. Dr. Bowman is going to talk today about development of a connectivity indicator for parks protected areas in Ontario. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Steve. Very nice of you to say. Sorry to cause you a lack of sleep. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Trent, because a lot of the work that I do involves grad students from Trent, and so I want to be sure to acknowledge that support. Okay, just see if I can figure out how to navigate the slides. So I'll have to use, okay. Okay, all right, we're good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about parks and protected areas, an indicator for parks and protected areas in Ontario. But I want to start with a question of how can we make a map of connectivity across Canada, because it's going to sort of feed into the indicator. And I want everybody to kind of understand the approach that we've taken. So why would we want to do that? Well, everybody here probably knows about the COP15 biodiversity agreement and how connectivity is right in there, you know, so there's a real need to have large scale maps and estimates of connectivity across Canada and globally even, you know, for these targets to be achieved. So why is that? Why is connectivity important? I'm going to just give you like 1 minute about that. This is my daughter about 10 years ago or something. So animal populations, they fluctuate. They can undergo small scale extinctions. And those things happen for a variety of reasons. But when it happens, if you don't have connectivity, then you can't get recolonization of patches, right? Patches become empty, and that leads to a loss of what we call the rescue effect. And the rescue effect is how you kind of recolonize empty patches on the landscape, right? And so if you don't have rescue effect, over time, these extinctions happen, and that lack of connectivity can lead to like a ratcheting up of the extinction rate over time, right? So the probability of extinction is related to the number of patches that are occupied in the landscape. So you really need to have a dynamic landscape where things can flow around, empty patches get recolonized, and all of that requires connectivity. In recent years, there's been a kind of coalescence, I would say, in the connectivity research community around using something called resistance modeling to estimate connectivity. So I'm going to give a quick overview of that. So a resistance model is just simply a model where you use a raster. So you make a raster and you assign costs of movement to different pixels on the raster, depending on what the raster pixels are representing. So in this case, in this figure, these red pixels are low cost. I should have made the red high cost, but I didn't. So the red is low cost in this map, okay? And that's this grassland, okay? It's a bison sort of easily able to move through the grassland, but the road is a higher cost, right? So in this case, we have two costs. We got a road and we got the grassland. And if you kind of look out over the landscape, those are costs for the bison, and you can, so that's a kind of species specific construct that we think of when we're making these cost maps. As you look out over the landscape, you can assign every type of land cover there to one of these pixel costs. And this is based on your information about the bison and how the bison experiences moving through the landscape in this case. So then you turn it into a raster, and it's a two-dimensional raster, right? And this is what we call a resistance surface. It's just a depiction of the costs of moving through the landscape from the perspective of the animal. We also call that a cost surface. So these two things are really the same, synonymous. There's a bunch of ways you can consider how to estimate the cost of traveling through a cost surface. If the costs are not very different, or they're not perceived by the animal, then Euclidean distance is one way, right? So that's just a straight line distance between the source and the destination. But you might also think about the least cost path, which I'm sure everybody here has heard of. It's like the path of least resistance, right? And in that case, because the red is lower cost than the blue here, then the least cost path is probably going to do something like that. It's going to navigate from point to point through the red. And that really depends on the cost, right? If the cost is very low, it might not be worth taking that extra distance, right? So there's a kind of trade-off between the distance and the cost, and that is how you estimate the least cost distance. The problem from a kind of large scale animal population ecology perspective is that least cost paths make an assumption that the animal in question has perfect knowledge of the landscape and can always take the optimal route, right? This is an optimal model. And that's pretty overly simplistic in a sense, because many animals don't have perfect knowledge of the landscape. And what's more likely is that it's kind of a probabilistic type of path that animals take. And so that can be solved by changing your model from the least cost distance to using something that is called circuit theory that is become more frequently used in the last decade or so. This allows you to estimate the probability of movement in any pixel. So in this case, we have a source and a destination, and it's a continuous surface. It uses some calculus to integrate across the surface, and you end up with a value there that's called current density, which is proportional to the probability of movement across this surface. So in the red, it's really close to the least cost path. Most animals that go from source to destination are going to move through the red. But there's some chance that animals will go all the way down to the blue, because animals they haven't perfect knowledge. And so, but the probabilities are lower. And you can mathematically show that current density is proportional to the probability of movement through a pixel. And so that's a useful quantity, because you can map current density if you use circuit theory, and then you can make maps that show you the probability of movement across the landscape. The other thing that we like to use, though, in circuit theory, it's another output, and that's like a effective distance between 2 points, also called a cost distance. And that is called, the quantity in circuit theory is called effective resistance. And it's a pairwise measure of the cost of traveling between two nodes, basically, right? You can't map this. So it's like a cost distance, a weighted distance that corresponds to the underlying cost map that produced the current density. So you get these two outputs. You get a current density map and you get an effective resistance map. Okay, I want to show you just a couple more ideas. One is that there's this concept called point-to-point connectivity, where we're just traveling from the source to the destination. You can predefine these. It could be from one park to another park. And that's a term that you'll see used. And it's really the kind of thing when you're connecting two places that you have in mind and you want to specifically connect them. But sometimes you don't want to connect two places a priori, like a one park to another park. You just want a general map of where things are moving through the landscape without relying on specific sources and destinations. And if you do that, then there's this thing called omnidirectional connectivity, where you move the nodes outside the map and then you connect them, all pairs of nodes. And now you have a map. It's like a continuous map across the landscape that's irrespective of node placement, which can be important for various types of applications. You know, if you don't want your map to apply to a specific context, you know, it's more general for like general land use planning, you know, then this omnidirectional connectivity is the way that you want to go. So there have been three, I think, important developments that I just want to quickly touch on that allow us to do this kind of big national map, this pan-Canadian connectivity map. I'm going to just mention them in turn here. Number one, you don't have to run the whole country at one time in a circuitscape map or circuit theory map. And that's good because those analyses are very data and computer intensive. So you can make tiles, and that allows you to, you know, sort of optimize your computing resources by using a smaller area. And what's important is that you can make accurate maps even with tiles, and the bigger the tiles, the better. So this shows you that in some types of habitats, as your tiles get smaller, this has the number of tiles on the x-axis, but you know that just means that more tiles, the tiles are smaller, right? So if the tiles are big, you can make an accurate map, and that's a correlation coefficient on the y-axis. Second point is that current density does not require you to know the absolute cost, which is very useful, because if you have like a snake, say, and it's traveling through across a road, well, you know that the road is more costly than the forest around the road, but you might not know exactly how much more, right? It's really hard to estimate the absolute cost because it requires like a lot of data. It's really an empirical question. You need to know about mortality rates and that kind of stuff. But if you just know that the road is more costly than the forest, you can make a good map, and the current density is not sensitive to the absolute cost. You just need to know the rank order of the cost, which is a very useful thing. And the second point is that, the third point, pardon me, is that you need to make a buffer around your maps or around your tiles, because all of these things are influenced by map edge effects. So if you want to put the nodes out into the buffer so that the nodes don't influence the map if you're doing omnidirectional connectivity. So to give you an example, and I'll just actually, I guess this figure is useful to point out the fact that on the on your right, that's just random data. The buffer can just be made up data. It doesn't have to be accurate. It just needs space for these random walking objects to flow through the landscape. So I'm going to show you an example from Eastern Ontario. So this is from 2014. It's a paper that's published Methods, Ecology, and Evolution. And this was work we did that was kind of in concert with some land use planning that was happening in Eastern Ontario. And so we have these eco districts, 6010 and 6011 and 69 and 6015. And they were building a natural heritage plan, they being planners in MNR. It may have been MNR then, or it may have been, I think it was before it was MNRF. I'm pretty sure it was MNR. Anyway, and they were interested in knowing about connectivity for their land use plan. So while they were doing this land use planning activity, we did a connectivity analysis to kind of relate to what they were doing. And we put a buffer around these eco districts. And then we made a cost map, right? So this is the raster, and we have 3 costs in this. And there's 3 types of costs: natural, permeable, and impermeable. So here we're using like what's called a naturalness approach, because we're trying to make a multi-species map, which is something that's useful for land use planning context. It's not species specific. So we're trying to kind of come up with something that's more of a multi-species approach that's dealing, sort of addressing species that use natural cover, like terrestrial species that use natural cover. And so this is what we came up with as a map. And then we can connect 2 nodes that are at the perimeter of the buffer. Okay, so that's what we did there. And then we can connect a couple more nodes. And as you see, as we're connecting more nodes over time, you see that the mean current density on the map kind of converges, right? So you don't need to do like 1,000 of these. You need to do a certain number until numbers of node pairs that you're adding to the map. And it turns out it's like you can get, once you get about 30 node pairs, you're getting a pretty consistent answer. And so that is, you can put the buffer back on. And so we have at that point an omnidirectional connectivity map of Eastern Ontario. And I'm going to show you more of these examples, but I wanted to give you that example that sort of breaks down how that analysis is done. How does it look on the landscape? So here's just a particular part. This is not Eastern Ontario, obviously. This is Uxbridge. And this is not part of that analysis I just showed you. It's just a neighboring area where we did a different analysis. And in this case, I'm just going to show you everything that's greater than 1 standard deviation above mean current density. So these are areas that are that have high probability of movement. Okay, I'm going to overlay them on the map here. So there's this is just the stuff that's above. If you just isolate. If you look on this figure here, the white stuff is more than 1 standard deviation above the mean current density. And it's green now. And then if you just put that on top of the map, you can see there's a lot of the flow through this landscape is where you would expect it would be. You know, this is an area that is kind of like funneling movement through the landscape. You know, the areas of natural cover are kind of pinching the current, right? There's this concept of the pinch point. Circuit theory is really good at identifying pinch points because all of the random walkers will flow through these constricted areas of natural cover. And you can see there just where the Uxbridge sign is on this map, that little blue label, there's a larger woodlot which does not have high current density. And that's because the current sort of spills out there. So it's important to keep in mind that with these current density maps, they don't really identify high probability of movement in large contiguous tracts of natural cover because the current is not pinched in those areas. So these analyses are really good at identifying places where there's constrictions, and high probability of movement is the thing to keep in mind. Okay, so back to kind of where I started, and these, the COP15 targets. Related to that, there's this Government of Canada initiative to start a new national program for ecological corridors. I became aware of this. So this news release was in 2022, April, you can see. And this is something that's being led by Parks Canada. And I became aware of this from conversations with Richard Pither, who's a collaborator of mine, who had been at Parks Canada and now works for ECCC. And prior to the announcement, he was aware of this. And so we kind of were discussing how it would be useful to produce a map across Canada, a pan-Canadian connectivity map that we could sort of feed into this process. Because there was no consistent map for the country that we could use to kind of evaluate alternatives. So we pulled together a team, which I'm showing here, to do this pan-Canadian connectivity project. Paul O'Brien, Angela Brennan, Richard, myself, Kristen Hirsch-Pearson. I would like to particularly point out Paul O'Brien because Paul is the guy who's done a lot of the analysis that I'm going to show you throughout this presentation. He's does it all in R, doesn't use ArcGIS at all, which I'm totally impressed with. So we spent a lot of time. So this was very, I went very quickly from who was on the team to the map, right? So there was a lot of work in between to come up with a way to do a cost map for Canada, but it's a 300-meter resolution cost map. And the details are here. This paper is published, so you can go and look at the details, and all the data are publicly available, so you can look at the data. But this is a multi-species cost map that's intended to, deal with terrestrial species that use natural cover, very much like that earlier example I showed you. In order to do this analysis efficiently across Canada, we used 17 tiles. We wanted to pretty much try and do each province as one tile, and we more or less did that with a couple of exceptions. And there's a couple of little areas that were like seams that we had to run extra tiles on. So these are the 17 tiles. And there's our map. So this is the first pan-Canadian connectivity map. And in this map, the areas that are red are high probability of movement, and the areas that are sort of the bluer colors are lower probability of movement. So lots of interesting things to look at. And again, this is a 300-meter resolution map. So these data are available. You can download them to, bring into your own study areas and have a look. To zoom in on a couple things, a lot of the features that we kind of expected to see, we see on this map. So that some of these areas are sort of established corridor projects like the Y2Y area, or, protected areas, systems, those kinds of things tend to show up on the map in a way that you might expect. In Ontario, one of the things I think that I want to point out that's really, I think, of interest and important is that south of James Bay, there's a real important corridor there. And, this is a spot that with climate warming, you can see in the future, potentially the boreal forest moving north and splitting, between east and west. So that's like a really, I think, important area for east-west flow in the boreal forest. We also see, just to zoom into the south a bit, the A2A really jumps out on these maps. Also, you can see the Rouge area that you heard about this morning on the map here. So lots of interesting features. We wanted to sort of test the hypothesis that we could predict movement of animals based on this map. And so we used a bunch of data sets, GPS, elk, caribou GPS data, and so forth. And generally speaking, for most of these data sets, the use of the areas of high current density are higher than random areas, and we're doing a big project right now to more extensively validate this map with a whole bunch of animal movement data from across the country. So we were then curious about ways that we could take advantage of this map, having made the map, to use it for other purposes. And one of the things we wanted to do was to try and kind of identify some areas for nature-based climate solutions. That was one of the things that we found that would be a potential use of the map. So here's a group of us, mostly M&R people, but also Richard Pither and a guy named John Gunn from University of New Hampshire, who's kind of a carbon accounting guy. And we used these maps by Soth et al., which maybe you've seen. These are maps of forest carbon and soil carbon. And we made these chloropleth maps, which are basically like, we divided these maps into quintiles, on each axis and overlapped them. And so what you can see here, the top right box is basically the highest forest carbon in this map, and then the highest current density. So this is overlaid with our map of current density. So this in the top right is an area that both has a lot of animal movement. It's important for animal movement, but it's also a place with a lot of forest carbon. Okay, so now we're looking at producing these chloropleth maps for different sort of contexts. So here's the map across the whole province of forest carbon and current density, so connectivity. The dark brown areas are the kind of hotspots for both of these. So they're kind of like nature-based solution win-wins, to sound very bureaucratic. We can also look at soil carbon. It's really noteworthy that soil carbon is much higher than forest carbon. So soil carbon is super important. And there are places in the north with very high soil carbon and that are also really important for connectivity. If we take the parks and protected areas and we overlay that on these maps, we can get a sense of how well we're doing at protecting these areas that are both important for carbon and for connectivity. And we can make these little maps. So if you kind of imagine the schematic of the chloropleth map on your left there, yeah, it's on the left. And then we can look at the proportion of those areas that are in protected areas, okay? And that's what you see on these two figures on your right, the B and C panels. And what you see is that the very highest priority forest carbon and current density land cover types, 12% of those are currently in parks and protected areas. And if you look at the soil carbon, 1% of those are currently in protected areas. So the good news is there's lots of opportunity there to get these nature-based climate solutions that also, benefit animal movement. Okay, so now we want to use these methods to develop an indicator of protected areas connectivity. So we have a group that has been working. These are mostly folks from MECP and Paul and I from M&R. And Natasha's kind of been going back and forth between MEC and M&R. Karen's here today, so you can ask her about this project. I want to just remind you that there's this idea of omnidirectional connectivity, and that's mostly what I've been talking about so far, right? We move the nodes outside because we want to have some kind of generic maps that we can use independently of parks and protected areas, but now we're actually trying to make an indicator. So the omnidirectional methods are not quite as relevant, to that question. So we're going back to the idea of point-to-point connectivity. Now, the challenge with an indicator, one of the challenges, is that the network is changing all the time, right? You can add parks to the network. Maybe you remove parks from a network, but the park network is dynamic. It's not fixed. And that's a problem with an indicator because you don't want to have this conflation of space and time, right? So we want to have a fixed network that we can look at the changes over time. And that's a key, I think, a key need for an indicator like this. And it was, I think, what I would say is our innovation in this project. We came up with the idea of using what we're calling sentinel nodes. Okay, so we have sentinel nodes, which we're defining as a subset of protected areas that we're going to use to assess changes in connectivity over time through the network. So we're identifying a subset of the parks that we're going to treat as nodes. And again, just to remind you, now we've mostly so far been talking about current density, which is that probability of movement. But for the indicator, we're really going to focus more on mean pairwise effective resistance. So the effective resistance is the cost distance between two nodes. And for this indicator, we can look at the pairwise cost distance between all of the sentinel nodes. And we're calling that the mean pairwise effective resistance. So I'll use that term a little bit. So importantly, you can't just have some arbitrary number of sentinel nodes. You need to know how many nodes do you need in order to get like a good estimate, right? That's reliable. So what the answer to that question, how many nodes, is you need enough nodes so that your estimates of current density and mean pairwise effective resistance do not depend on sample size, right? So there's a clear typo in my presentation. Do not depend are independent of sample size. So what I mean there is that they're independent of sample size. So we want to figure out that, right? We need to have enough nodes so that the sample size of nodes doesn't affect the result. Because that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in the network changing, right? So the way we did this, and this is work that Paul did, was to basically randomly sample. So we have this parks network, and we can randomly sample 2 parks, and then we can randomly sample 3 parks and 4 parks and 5 parks. And every time we randomly sample parks, we do an analysis with circuit theory, do it a whole bunch of times, and eventually you get this asymptote, right? And once the asymptote flattens out, you know you have enough nodes that your answer is no longer going to depend on the nodes. And as it turns out, so that's on the left here, that's current density, right? And that's correlation coefficient between pairs of maps with different current densities, right? So we're basically doing these spatial correlations. And on the right is the mean pairwise effective resistance. And you can see there, it's like a regression to the mean, right? There's a lot of variability, but once you get up to a certain sample size, then it's pretty dependent, it's pretty stable. And that turns out that you need about 50 nodes in order to get a good estimate of the network. Slightly more than with the omnidirectional map, where you needed like 30. But it's pretty interesting that we could still arrive at a stable number like that. Okay, so now we want to do a little experiment in Eastern Ontario with this concept in order to see whether our indicator, mean pairwise effective resistance, is sensitive to changes in the network, right? So we have a fixed network here. We've randomly selected a bunch of parks and protected areas in this landscape. And now we have a fixed set of them within the network. And we just connect them. We do a little circuitscape run there. But now, and so we get this estimate, mean pairwise effective resistance 49.58 ohms. Doesn't mean that much in and of itself, right? It's a relative measure. But then we can do something like we can simulate a development. So here we simulate a 157 kilometer square development. And by simulating a development, all we're doing is changing the map, right? We just change the cost map and make some kind of development in the place that we want to make it. And we rerun this. And you can see how the current goes right around the development, right? And the mean pairwise effective resistance there is 49.65 ohms. Likewise, we can simulate a park. And so this is a new park down in the bottom. And this simulated new park is not now a node. It's not a node. It's just got a lower cost because it's regulated as a park in this simulation. So regulated parks in this indicator have a lower cost. At least not if there's a road, you know, the road feature would not have a low cost, but the natural cover areas of the park have a low cost. And so we do that, and we do this again, and then we get 49.57 ohms. So just with this quick little example, you can see that the indicator works the way you might expect, right? As you add more parks, you get a lower cost. As you add more developments, you get a higher cost. So this is what we came up with then as what we're calling Ontario's Sentinel Node Network. This paper was just accepted in Peer J. It should be out in a week or two. The underlying cost map is the same cost map as the Pither paper. It's a 300-meter resolution cost map. The difference is that in this map, the parks and protected areas get a lower cost. And there are 50 sentinel nodes, which were distributed across the map in parks. And there's the current density that we, of this analysis. So this is the map that you get when you connect all of these in a circuit theory run. This was one big analysis of the province. That just to show you the comparison with the map, the omnidirectional map, using almost the identical cost surface. And these are very closely related. The correlation coefficient between them is 0.76. Some slight differences because that one is omnidirectional and this one is point to point. So it's really internal. The nodes are inside the map. On the right side, the nodes are outside the map. So there's a bit of a difference there. But the predicted areas of current flow and so forth are quite similar. The other thing that you can do with this analysis is look at the isolation of individual sentinel nodes. So we have this thing that we're calling the node isolation index, which is basically just the mean of all the connections of a node to all of its neighbors. Okay, and so if you're more isolated, then that is going to be a higher number. And so you can see here on this map, on the B panel on the right side, things that are farther north are farther on the x-axis, right? That's a northing there. And so all the stuff that's highly isolated is more in Southern Ontario, not surprisingly, right? So you can see in Southern Ontario, there's a lot of spread. Some things are well connected, but a lot of things are pretty isolated. The most isolated being Mara Provincial Park, which is interesting because it's right on a lake, so, and it's on the other side of that park, it's highways and stuff. So that park is surrounded by a lake on one side, which contributes to the isolation of the park. And you can map it this way and you get a sense of the node isolation. We're just using node size to reflect the isolation of those. And all those large nodes are in the south. And our intention is that this is something that can be reassessed over time to look at changes in the connectivity of the parks network. That cost map can be used over time because it's not dependent on the land cover. It's an independent raster that you can assign the contents to, so that cost map can be updated over time and rerun in this analysis. Okay, just to wrap up, a couple more points I wanted to make. We had this pan-Canadian connectivity map. One of the things that I've been working on separately from this is I've been doing a lot of disease surveillance work. In particular, I'm involved in SARS-CoV-2 wildlife surveillance. And what we've found in Ontario is we've found that there's a divergent lineage of SARS-CoV-2 in southwestern Ontario in white-tailed deer. And the most recent common ancestor are deer from Michigan. I shouldn't say deer from Michigan, it's mink from Michigan, actually from a mink farm. We assume there were some deer involved in Michigan, but they weren't sampled. So anyway, we have evidence that this spread into Ontario from Michigan, right? And so it's just an example of the transboundary nature of things like disease risk. And there's quite a bit of interest right now in trying to plan surveillance around disease risk. And so on the flip side of that, for biodiversity reasons, we're interested in maintaining connections, these transboundary connections. So these are important. They're kind of a double-edged sword, but important in both contexts. So we wanted to just extend these methods to try and design transboundary wildlife disease surveillance. I'm involved in a national working group that plans disease surveillance for SARS-CoV-2 and also for avian influenza. So again, a group here, including Mike Brown from ECCC, a former grad student with my group, and Simon Tapper, and Paul and I. And so we decided we have this Canadian map, let's make an American map that matches. So we used a bunch of tiles. We made a very, very similar cost surface at the same resolution. And this hasn't been published yet, but we're working on the paper as we speak. And there's our high resolution Canada-US connectivity map. Pretty big undertaking, I have to say. And just to focus on a couple of things, if we're looking at Ontario, this map really does a nice job of showing that there are like 3 spots that are really super important for connection to the US in Ontario. And these are because of the nature of the Great Lakes, they constrict a lot of flow into the province for terrestrial species. And these areas are important. And so they're going to be important places to do disease surveillance, but they're also important to maintain connections for biodiversity. Over time, as climate warms, we'll probably have a deficit of biodiversity in Ontario unless we maintain these connections to the US, because a lot of species are moving north, right? So just to give you one empirical example, I've also been involved in bobcat genetics research, and it's kind of striking to me that all the places where bobcat genes are flowing into the province are exactly the same places that are flagged by our map here as being really important connections. And that's my talk. There's a whole bunch of collaborators on this work, and they're listed here, and I have to really acknowledge all the work of many collaborators. And that's my webpage. If you want to get copies of these papers, they're mostly all of the ones that I've showed so far are open access. So you can get the papers, the data is all public. You can ask me questions. Thanks for the attention.
Dr. Bowman, and I'm just blown away. Let me tell you, I've got more papers to add to my next course in the winter.
Hope you sleep well.
Far away, yes.
Any questions?
Would you say the end goal is like a worldwide connectivity map? Is that too much of an undertaking?
Well, maybe for me. There has been so Angela Brennan, who's one of the collaborators that I mentioned on the Pan-Canadian map, has actually done a global analysis of protected areas connectivity. It's published in Science actually last year. The challenge is, computer resources. So her map is quite coarse. I don't remember the scale, but it's like, several kilometers of resolution. So, in the future, maybe it will be possible with computing resources to do a really high resolution map, but there is a global map. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great talk, Jeff. That was a really impressive undertaking, and I really want to get my hands on that data. I immediately Google searched the paper to see if I could find the map and get the 300 resolution. Oh, is that still on? I tried opening it up. Is it like a GIS layer that you could add to a map? I know you said you coded it in R, so how do I extract?
So it'll be like it depends on the layer that you're looking for, but it might be just a TIFF file that you can import,
Okay.
as a raster, or depends on the data. Some of the data are stored as like data files, but a lot of those rasters are stored as TIFF, as like a TIFF file, which you could then import into some either R or ArcGIS and turn it into a raster that you can analyze.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. If you have questions, though, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to give you a hand with that. Yep.
Jeff, what is the next step? How this information is going to be used for decision making in actually now doing the protection, conservation, establishment of things? Do you guys participate at that level, or you just provide the information to others?
Well, yeah, I don't think I can. Not to try and sidestep your question, but I don't necessarily know what the next steps are. Like with respect to it depends on the tool. Like I know that on the Pan-Canadian map, so Parks Canada, as you know, is undergoing a consultation process to develop this national corridor program, and our map is used in that consultation process. So it's being used there. We've provided our indicator to Ontario Parks, and I think that the plans are to include that in you know, state of the resources reporting kind of applications over time, and that indicator will be used. But you know, that's kind of out of my bailiwick, but I'm happy to support it. Yep.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. I can see all kinds of applications for this. Question about lakes. So obviously Canada has like a ton of lakes, and it looked like they're given the same resistance value as like urban areas. I'm just wondering, just given that those lakes are frozen for half of the year and, you know, things can swim, have you played around with the data where you don't give lakes quite the same level of resistance?
For sure. Like, I mean, it's a good question. Lakes are important. They're very important. And you know, they freeze in the winter. A lot of stuff will go across the frozen lake. So we have played around with it. I think there's probably some value in having some winter maps. You know, they would be a bit different, right? Especially in the north, right, where there's a lot of lakes. I think the big lakes would still be barriers. So you'd have to play around with the size a bit, you know. And we've experimented with that, but it's something we've been thinking about.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you.
Next.
Gonna make the transition over here, colleagues. Professor McGregor, if we can get, there we are. I think we've got Professor McGregor as logged in as me probably, because the Zoom's been playing funny shenanigans actually. You can wave at me, Professor McGregor. There we go, I see her. So I think we're all good actually. I think we're actually all good. Professor McGregor, you can share your screen. Give that permission. It'll show up as me. There we go. Very good. And once we get everything set up here, I'll do the introduction, then turn it over to Professor McGregor. I think we are good to go, despite Zoom shenanigans, actually, for Professor McGregor. Professor Deborah McGregor is a associate professor, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. She and colleagues actually in 2021 wrote this extremely thought-provoking paper, which I'm still trying to sort through, which sort of thinks about how do we actually not just do tokenism, but think about how to incorporate sort of the ideas of indigenization within undergraduate education in particular and beyond. So just that alone would be worth the price of admission. And we've got Professor McGregor here to talk about so much more than that. She focuses on Indigenous knowledge systems and applications in water and environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, as well as sustainable development. And again, one could go on with that. Huge accomplishments. She coordinated the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Environment and Climate Justice Symposium and the website. You can go there today and take a look at sort of what's been going on. But I'm going to turn that over because you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from her. And we're fortunate and pleased to have Professor McGregor deliver our closing formal presentation today. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor McGregor.
Thank you. Can folks hear me? I guess.
Go here in person.
Okay. So thank you for having me. Yes, wish I could be there in person, but I'm in my community, Whitefish River First Nation. And if I look out, I see McGregor Bay and Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. Presented before, just talking about the Great Lakes. So I'm a Great Lakes Anishinaabe person. So as listening to the presentation, looking at the agenda, and I'm hoping that what I have to say is relevant to you in some way. But it's on my mind, thinking about how do you link decolonization to conservation. I just think about conservation broadly in terms of protected areas, parks, conserved areas, and reconciliation. I'm still looking at this week as being, National Day of Truth and Reconciliation was last Saturday. Most First Nations celebrated that day on Monday, so it's still on the brain. I'm also part of a big Shark Partnership grant called Conservation as Reconciliation. So this is what I think about quite a bit. And actually, I'll talk a little bit about that project and where you can access some of the resources if this is something that you're interested in. But as I was listening to the presentation, there was some words that were, or because I think I operate in this world that's very, I think, longstanding, but different than probably most people hear about. So when I did my PhD in forestry at the University of Toronto, so sometimes there'd be words that people would use that sort of didn't really work for me, like in reforestation, you want to colonize and recolonize. I'm like, indigenous person, we don't really like those words. But so just in terms of sometimes science communication out to indigenous peoples, these things need to be thought through a little bit. So what I wanted to do was talk to you about how I'm making these connections, and hopefully, there are connections for you as well in terms of the work that you do. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I call it like I just operate in the matrix. There's how people and governments and civil society and ENGOs kind of understand the world, and then there's how I understand the world. So when I see maps, in my mind, I'm seeing treaties, land claims, where First Nations are. So I just look at the world in a very different way. So I also wanted to talk about sort of Anishinaabe concepts of conservation as I understand them, because when you talk about decolonization, this happens in my field a lot, whatever context I find myself working in, you need to move towards something. Like when you're deconstructing something, you still need to build and move towards something. And at the moment, that's reconciliation. However, we're understanding it. Could probably survey the room, could probably say in the chat, tell me what your view of reconciliation is, and it would be very different. And I'll talk about different conceptions of what that is and how it relates to conservation. So that's enough of an introduction there, but hopefully hopefully I make sense to you. So in my mind, as I sit here and look out at, the waters and the lands that my ancestors would have been on for thousands of years, for us as, I'll speak more specifically from a First Nation perspective, because I'm First Nations, I can't claim to have a Métis or Inuit perspective at all, is we start with creation, like how we were here for thousands of years. And that's the knowledge, the science, the land governance, I guess you could say, the laws and protocols that were here for thousands of years. So that's always my starting point. And the reason why that becomes really important is almost everything else is like new, really, relatively speaking. When you consider how long Indigenous folks have been around the Great Lakes, and that tends to change the better the science gets. So they can kind of measure how one measures these kinds of things. But the point also that I try to make here is that we were a complete society. So as complete societies, we had our own governance systems, we had our own laws, we had our own knowledge systems, which includes science. We had all the things that a society needs in order to flourish. That's what we had. We're not just populations, as I often see in the literature, we're peoples and nations and complete societies. So I think about the thousands of years that my ancestors were here and what they knew and how this can help people right now trying to address various ecological climate crises that exist, that basically facing us all at this time. So we've always been here. This is an image of the late Josephine Mondawmin from Wikwemekong, not too far from where I'm situated right now, walked around all the Great Lakes. And again, just re-emphasizing this point that this knowledge exists. I understand it to exist. A part of my job as an academic and a scholar and educator is trying to mobilize that into different spaces so that it could be part, like other knowledge that could be part of decision making. Indigenous peoples are decision makers. In the community that I'm in, people make decisions. So we also need knowledge, and we also want to access science as well. So actually open access is also very helpful because people don't often can get through the firewalls that are often associated with universities. Then the language just has to become accessible so people can actually make decisions around it. So to me, that's kind of where I'm going as I start this is, in my mind, in my experience, that's most of the knowledge that exists in the Great Lakes where we are right now and in other places in Canada. There we go. So the planetary, I call it a planetary health crisis because it encompasses, water, ecosystem, biodiversity, climate. So we're in a crisis, and all of it caused by humans, and it's not getting better. Every time one of the big reports comes out, recently the IPCC report earlier this year, it's not looking good. And in my view, part of this is I've been involved in some of the IPCC assessments and some of Canada's climate assessments as a contributing author, usually contributing sort of the Indigenous components to this. And there's a real, there's different words that people use to describe this. To me, from my experience, there's a lack of, we don't have the knowledge base to really, I think, tackle the kind of challenges that we're facing. I found it was hugely biased, what I was asked to do to the peer-reviewed literature, which is fine. But if we weren't asking the right questions, like 4 decades ago, 3 decades ago, 2 decades ago, we don't have that body of knowledge. And certainly Indigenous peoples were not in these spaces to be, leading a lot of this kind of research. So there's a lot of knowledge left out there that is not making it into assessments and decision-making tables. And again, that's part of the work that I try to do, is try to bring that into these spaces. So in my mind, we get, I just call them the disaster reports, because that's kind of what they point to every single time. And we don't have all the knowledge out on the table to make the best decisions possible. And that's what a lot of the assessments do, is influence nation states policymaking. So truth and reconciliation. So part of this project around conservation as reconciliation recognizes the role that colonization and cultural genocide played in the oppression of Indigenous peoples and alienation of Indigenous peoples from their lands. So people are wanting to do conservation, protected areas, parks. That's on Indigenous lands. That would be the matrix alternative universe that I would present to you, saying, look at these maps. That's where treaties are. That's where my treaty is. There's a park there. We're alienated from that, although that's improving. But all of this ties back to this history of colonization that was revealed in a number of reports, but more recently been hugely influential. And I think a catalyst for having these kind of conversations was a Truth and Reconciliation report in 2015. I also show an image of the residential school that my mother went to in Spanish along the North Shore. So what's the context for conservation in Canada? So the context is that a lot of these policies that we've heard about, hopefully you've heard about over the last week, hugely detrimental to Indigenous peoples, was because there was this effort to try to gain control over the lands and resources that Indigenous peoples had. One could argue that continues in various ways. So that's sort of like the broader kind of historical context for how, Indigenous peoples experience conservation in its various iterations. And if you don't account for this, if you don't account for this history, then there's a very real possibility that whatever strategies people have for conservation, protection, restoration could recolonize Indigenous peoples and those lands. And I'm hoping that most people are not cool with that, because I'm not. So it's so you have to be aware of this and account for it in your work. Very hard for scientists to do because they don't learn it. When would you learn this in school? When I'm asked to speak about this to scientists and biologists, they have a hard time, because when would they have ever when would they have been exposed to this and learned about this? I also worked in Environment Canada Science-Based Department for 10 years. So this is part of my job, trying to explain how all of this history is relevant to the work that they do. And actually not history, it's playing out all the time before us. So I just wanted to, so this particular image is, because it's actually a thing, there's actually subfields, I guess you could say, called colonial conservation. But I wanted to show this image because for a long time, in my experience, I shared a story earlier this week, or was it last week, where one of the first papers I tried to publish as an academic, which was probably about 30 pages, ended up being 5. It was on conservation protected areas and parks. Editors, peer reviewers didn't want to hear about this colonial history, how sometimes these parks and protected areas were set up deliberately to exclude Indigenous people. So people didn't want to hear the truth. And so it was kind of taken out and silenced in that way. But now there's other ways that people can tell these stories. And this was just one example in one of the parks where there's other forums of being able to tell these stories or tell the truth about what happened and continues to happen from Indigenous people. So I think that's relevant in these conversations around, it isn't just reconciliation, it's truth and reconciliation, and people need to hear the truth of what happened to people and continues to happen to people. And sometimes that's really hard. But it's better to hear it than kind of shut it down and not want to hear it. Eventually it's going to come out in one way, shape or form. So what is reconciliation? So this, I'm drawing this from the TRC report. I'm just going to see if I can manage myself time-wise here. What is reconciliation? So one comes directly from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what I like about this is it's a verb. It's an ongoing process, right? Like, but we're trying to get somewhere. We're trying to get somewhere with reconciliation, but it took so long to get to this point. It's going to take us a long time to get out of this, often conflict ridden situation. So that often we find ourselves in different ideas about what should be happening to the land or to the earth. So I also focus in my work a lot of the times on Principle 8. I work in a law school and Faculty of Environmental Studies, and they adopted one of the calls to action to teach law students about a whole host of things in Call to Action 28. And I tend to focus on this particular aspect because most of my research deals with Indigenous knowledge, environmental governance, broadly speaking. So what is it? So to consider reconciliation or try to achieve it, we're considering Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, our laws, and our protocols, the connection to the land. And what does that look like? So if you're wanting to contribute to reconciliation, you think about these. And this is only one principle. I just look at the world through my sort of environment sustainability lens, and that's what I tend to hone in on. There's other principles that, of course, matter just as much. So I call this earth-based reconciliation, again, because that's the lens I tend to apply to this work, is what I noticed in reading the Truth and Reconciliation reports was this idea of reconciliation with the earth. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had elders and knowledge keepers guiding this process, and they had their own forum and they had their own discussions. And they said, basically, reconciliation between people is not going to be ever complete unless we reconcile our relationship with the earth. And humans right now don't seem to have a great relationship with the natural world. So I've become, I guess, somewhat obsessed with trying to understand, what does this look like and what does it mean? How can we do this? Everyone do this, not just Indigenous people in the places that we are. That's why, in my mind, land acknowledgements are important. Like, where are you, like, in terms of Indigenous space and understanding? Here's just an image of that I think about as being Indigenous conceptions of reconciliation, and this reconciliation with the earth are again, the late Josephine Mondawmin leading the water walks around the Great Lakes, because she wasn't just raising awareness about water, she was also trying to engage in ceremony and song to try to heal the water and the people at the same time. And this is just an image of her teaching youth. So what is our context? I'm not going to read all of this, but the point again I'm trying to make here, going back to my first set of slides, is that we are societies. We had our knowledge systems. We dealt with change. We dealt with new challenges. I'm not saying we were perfect. I don't have time today to tell stories that I might look at as being conservation stories, but we made mistakes, some big mistakes, and people suffered because of them. But the trick was, because we were self-determining, sovereign and autonomous at the time, we could solve them in the way that was appropriate in terms of our knowledge and our laws and our culture. So certainly we weren't perfect, but we had our own ways of trying to flourish and address the challenges that we were facing. So we have our own context that's, thousands of years old. Now we're trying to figure out, and hopefully others are trying to figure out how we reconcile and negotiate ourselves in these kind of spaces if we have this objective of trying to help the earth and people in the meantime. So I just wanted to share this. I think in my first sort of initial correspondence with Professor Murphy was Indigenous science. So that's a whole other I guess presentation that I often deliver, usually to STEM students actually. So, but I work. A lot of our stories also have ecological knowledge and biological knowledge in them. So I just have the muskrat in this image because one of the ones that a lot of Anishinaabe work with is our recreation story, when the muskrat brings the earth up from the soil from when there's a flood, a destruction. And through that knowledge of what you know about the muskrat tells you about the biology of the muskrat. In that story, other animals try, but they're not able to succeed in getting that soil. But if you understand the muskrat's biology, then you know why the muskrat is the one that's able to succeed in that story. So embedded in these stories, and folks who are skilled to do this are able to draw out that knowledge, be able to draw out that science from those stories. So that's all I'll say about that, because I don't have time, but I do want to say, if you work with Indigenous peoples, that's often how they're conveying knowledge, is through storytelling. So there's reasons for that. There's knowledge embedded within that, and it does require a skill to be able to draw that out without extracting or exploiting or appropriating it, because there's a skill there involved. UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Certainly, Aboriginal and treaty rights plays a role in reconciliation, recognition, and respect for them. But the reason I picked this is Article 25 in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is because it focuses on responsibility. So we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. And these responsibilities extend out to the natural world and to future generations. When you're trying to make conservation decisions, that's what you're thinking about. What are my responsibilities to the natural world? For us, it relates oftentimes to our clan system, our names and who we are, but also to future generations. That's what you're thinking about. I like the presentation before and the picture of the young girl in there. To me, that's a reminder, like, who are we doing this for? We have to sometimes because of our careers, but also we're wanting to do it for think about it also in terms of responsibilities. So our knowledge, so a little bit is getting into the nature of our knowledge. I would spend a whole course on this topic, but we don't have a whole course right now. Is where do we draw our knowledge from? What is the source of our knowledge? Certainly the same way other people get it, from other people. So we get it from, learning from other people. But the land itself is also regarded as our teachers and relatives. So again, when I started off saying, sometimes people using the words colonization, recolonization make me a little squeamish, even though I know the context for that, just because it's, I think, got a trigger for someone like me. So we don't think about the natural world as being natural resources. You think about it as being like your teachers and relatives, and that's where you'd be drawing knowledge from. You would be learning from the natural worlds as teachers and often as relatives. So this is just pictures of around, a couple of kilometers from where I'm sitting right now in the place that I come from. Knowledge also lives in people, community, and places. The reason why, to me, this is really important to mention is because a lot of the field of Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, maybe some of you are familiar with it, is very extractive. And, you know, because it's been around 3 to 4 decades, showing up most certainly in federal legislation, you know, since the late 1990s. And, but a lot of the methods, the research methods are geared towards extracting this from people. And then someone goes off and makes decisions. But that's not appropriate or an Indigenous perspective on this at all. You need to have people there. They're part of the decision-making process. You don't need to extract this knowledge from people. Knowledge sharing paradigms are a lot more appropriate and certainly becoming a lot more prevalent now than when I first started my career 30 years ago, when it was all about the best way and the most ethical way to extract from Indigenous people. Not appropriate. It's recognizing Indigenous people are societies. This knowledge is theirs, important to the community. They make decisions with Indigenous peoples. It lives in the practices. So our concept of Indigenous knowledge, like a lot of, so the concept itself, it didn't originate in Indigenous communities. We have our own, like more from an international policy context after the Earth Summit, the Brundtland Report. People have their own concept of what this is, and often it's a verb. Until you can gain knowledge, but until you enact it, it's not really knowledge yet. It doesn't be. It has to become a verb. You verb action it, becomes knowing. So the way I would learn in school, I would, you know, read textbooks, write exams, and people could test what I know. But I wasn't required to actually do anything about it. I didn't have to demonstrate it in my life in order to, you know, pass the course or the exam or whatever. So mind you, there is some cases where that does happen. You don't really know until you can actually practice it. So there's other knowledges like that. So for us, it's a verb. It's how you practice. It's what you're actually doing, how it gets passed on from generation to generation. This is just a picture of my family's, we call it sugar bush. We do make maple syrup in the spring. So in this, you have embodied knowledge. There's things I remember as a child since I can remember coming here. I don't even remember ever not coming there. That I remember about certain times of the year and weather, certain, of course, it's changing now, that you actually, your body remembers a lot of this because you were living it. It's not just abstract that I read somewhere. That even if I forget something intellectually, my body still remembers what it was like when there was a lot of snow and you had to go from tree to tree, and when the snow was very deep versus maybe when it was dry, that particular spring. Okay, let me just check the time. Teachers and guides, again, a lot of them are elders. I work in a world where PhD is valued, and I work in that knowledge system, but in Indigenous knowledge systems, our most knowledgeable are often elders or traditional knowledge holders, or what I call practitioners, people who actually, you know how to do things on the land. I'm just going to make this quick here because everyone can read this, hopefully. The main point I want to make here is it isn't just Indigenous knowledge. That's, in my mind, been part of the problem for a decade. It's actually recognizing Indigenous knowledge systems. I'm an academic at York University. Before that, University of Toronto, went through the system like many of you did. I'm part of a society that produces knowledge in a particular way. And I participate in that, publish, do conferences, do all that. And Indigenous peoples have their own knowledge systems for what counts as knowledge, who are considered to be the expert, where does knowledge come from? And what's happening when you're trying to work with Indigenous knowledge, you're actually working with Indigenous knowledge systems, and that's what you need to respect. Otherwise, it becomes, you know, an extractive kind of exploitive process, and it really needs to involve people. So that's how I think about it, because I operate in both all the time. Some things are similar, but some things are actually quite different. So I just wanted to just mention this because I was quite struck with this United Nations efforts around conservation, living in harmony with nature by 2050. So really that's not that far away. And every disaster report is pointing to like, we're moving away from this. So how do we try to achieve this, right? And but there was also a recognition of Indigenous knowledge and customary land rights and governance. But I noticed they weren't prepared to go down like what our laws look like route. That's another conversation to have around that. And I could kind of see how this understanding of the natural world is like trying to find expression in some of the initiatives around conservation, like nature-based solutions, you know, trying to recognize Indigenous peoples within this wide, you know, ecosystems are important, ecosystem services sort of language in terms of recognition how the natural world can actually help us as opposed to always being managed or governed by people. All these disaster reports call for transformation. We need to have transformation in terms of society in order to move towards this harmony by 2050, which isn't actually a lot of time, right? So there's recognition of Indigenous peoples. What does Indigenous-led conserved areas look like? That's a big federal priority at the moment. Also part of this conservationist reconciliation project that I'm involved with. What does that look like? How do you enable that? How do you sustain that? Because a lot of this, as you know, can change quite dramatically when governments change. Politics can interfere quite a bit with our goals. And recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems. So I think it's an important goal. And I think where people get stuck is how do you do it? Like, what does this transformation look like? What does our imagination tell us about what is our lives going to be like if we try to achieve this? Which would be for most of us still in our lifetime. Okay. I have about 15 more minutes. I will stop because I do want to, you know, feel some questions or commentary from folks as well. So what's an Anishinaabe ontology conservation? I'm going through a lot of content with you, so hopefully a lot of this is making sense. So again, when I say we need to decolonize, and I think there's a large body of work on, you know, kind of what does that look like? What do we don't want? Colonial conservation. How to move towards reconciliation, but what would be sort of, you know, Indigenous concepts of what would be, I would be trying to work on and trying to achieve. What does that kind of look like? And the reason I say ontology is because that just basically means what do we consider to be real? What's real in our lives? How are we trying to achieve this? What's been our reality for thousands of years? What did we do? How did we consider our relationship to the natural world? So this, for us, it's caring for one's relatives, our kin and our teachers, rather than trying to govern and manage it. Healing those relationships, because as there was colonization of Indigenous peoples, there was also colonization of our lands, and they were harmed as well, because we consider the earth also as having agency and a relative. So when the earth is harmed, the earth also needs to be healed, which makes sense when I think about what the elders said as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We need to heal and reconcile this relationship with the earth because it's a harmful one. It requires the retention and revitalization of Indigenous knowledge systems and language, particularly in support of well-being. So what you'll often see in the United Nations, and I think people are trying to drill this down in many cases, like the case examples of this is about 20% of the landmass on the planet is, I say, caretaken by Indigenous peoples, and that's where 80% of the biodiversity is, and that's where Indigenous languages are spoken. So there's a connection there. In Canada, again, I work for Environment Canada, most of the species at risk in Canada are in First Nation communities, because as everyone else is developing and, you know, I guess, eradicating the habitat of a lot of the species, most of them are in First Nation communities. In Ontario, particularly Walpole Island. A lot of the intact Carleton forest is in First Nation communities, Six Nations, Walpole Island, and others. So, you know, so people know this, but what does it mean in terms of how we're going to govern, how we're going to work together in terms of, you know, trying to engage in this transformation to living in harmony with the natural world. Part of our ontology is respecting the agency of the earth itself. So, and that's a picture of my 2-year-old great niece learning how to help in the sugar bush. It's never too early to start. So what matters? Often I find myself in a lot of climate change circles. A lot of my research relates to the priorities of First Nations. And I worked a lot on water, from forestry to water, and environmental justice, and now climate justice, because that's priority of a lot of First Nations. And I find myself in a lot of these circles, and I think about what motivates us to do the work that we do. So I never really hear people talking about love, but I always hear it in First Nation context. They always talk about love for the earth and love for future generations. So to me, it's actually relevant in these conversations, especially when we're thinking about our future. What does it mean to begin to live in harmony with the natural world? It means, hopefully, because we love it, and our future generations and our current generations, and we want to act out of those motivations as well, like something positive as opposed to fear and crisis all the time. So we ask ourselves a different set of questions. Do we love our future generations? Will our research benefit future generations? On a Manitoulin Island, there's actually the Indigenous Research Ethics Protocol, where you're required to answer that question. They have the teachings of the 7 original, or teachings of the 7 grandfathers, and that's one of the values, and you have to demonstrate that, whether you're a scientist or not. My sister is the chair of that committee. I like to be on it sometimes just to see how people answer that question. So there's different, I don't think there's so much different, but for us, they're out there. We talk about it openly, we say so. I think it is shared by other people, but maybe not shared as much as we've like. This is my other great niece, a picture of her as she's learning how to obtain food on her own. So I want to end with this. Yes, I am going to be on time, because I think it's important around these ideas about reconciliation. And so this is actually a teaching that was shared by Isaac Day. He's an artist and storyteller, so he would tell the story far. I'm not a storyteller in the way that he is. And the way that he describes it is, in a lot of our art is always about drawing connections. Everything is connected to everything else. And this is Norvell Morso's piece on our recreation story. And what he says is, science is a way of telling a story about the earth. That's what we're trying to do in different ways. You've heard presentations today. There are different ways of telling a story about the earth. Anishinaabe people, Indigenous people, First Nations people have different ways of telling the story, this unfolding, this continuous unfolding of creation. That's how we think about science. It's part of this whole story of the unfolding of the earth. So I think it's becoming increasingly recognized that the Indigenous knowledge systems are really important. Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge systems. It's not appropriate to seek Indigenous knowledge without, Indigenous people. To me, I guess it's obvious, but it's actually not a lot of the time. So how different peoples are going to work together, that we're all part of the story of creation. We need to share each other's knowledge so we can make the best decisions that we can to transform and get to this point where we're able to really care and love our future generations, and move towards this living in harmony with the earth, because that's the vision. I think it's a worthwhile vision. So we're all part of the story. We need to work together. We need to figure that out. So I like that, because it's true, again, because I think Indigenous peoples also, they want access to science because they want to make the best decisions for their communities and children and future generations as well. So miigwech, hopefully all of this made sense. Hopefully it wasn't like, what is she talking about? We are talking about, species going across Great Lakes or not. So conservation is as reconciliation. So I hope some of this resonated with you. And I hope, there's enough of left of the day for you to go outside and enjoy the natural world. So I'm going to stop share, and I'm happy to hear some commentary and questions, because I think I actually finished in time to allow that. So Chimigwech for your time.
Yes, indeed. We have lots of time actually for questions from both the Zoom audience as well as in person. Thank you, Professor McGregor. That was both beautifully woven and a challenge actually for all of us in this room, I think, and on Zoom as well. So I really appreciate your words and You've discounted a few times not being able to tell stories. I don't know. I thought the stories were really good from there, much better than I could ever do. Unfortunately, I'm not very good at it. So folks, I will turn it over to the audience, both on Zoom. Stephanie's monitoring the commentary, as well as in the room. Are there any questions for Professor McGregor? We have one coming up.
Okay, so we read one of your papers in our policy and governance class, and I was just wondering, is there a way to integrate Indigenous knowledge in policymaking that isn't extractive? Because you mentioned like how the impact assessment in 2019 like took bits and pieces, but it decontextualized like traditional ecological knowledge. So I'm wondering, like, do we need to restructure the entire way we do policy, and by extension, like a government system that's built on colonialism, or is there a way to like have both? What are your thoughts?
I know which paper you read. I think it's possible. It's just not happening, I guess you could say. When I think about, like when I worked for Environment Canada, a large part of my energy and effort and advocacy within the organization itself, even though people don't like to use that word so much in government, is because it was showing up traditional knowledge. There's various vocabulary for this, and it kind of changes over time. Like species at risk, it's ATK, tech in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Was there to be some sort of leadership? Because really, as you know, the paper said, a lot of the field is actually controlled by proponents, so they're collecting the knowledge, they're using it for their own purposes, funding, certain aspects of the whole like Indigenous knowledge systems, and that was always alarming to me. And so you will see it mentioned, Indigenous knowledge mentioned in policy, but sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, depending on the government of the day, unfortunately. And just recently, actually this week, I was reviewing a paper by Indigenous Climate Action, and they were analyzing federal climate policy. And so what you see is the recognition of Indigenous people in there. So you see Indigenous-led, Indigenous knowledge systems, but what they struggle with is actually how to make that real. So I'll try to answer this more quickly, but one thing that I've been sort of kind of grabbing onto more recently, or sort of giving me sort of a glimmer of hope, is the Climate Science 250 report, because in there they talk about Indigenous-led research, Indigenous-led science. Like, what does that look like? It doesn't mean it's not including other people. Like I said, like we need to be able to share knowledge to, meet these challenges that we're facing. So I think it's there in that very theoretical and kind of abstract way, but I want to see how they make that actually happen. What does it look like? Because that's like Climate Science 250. It's now 2023. That report came out, I think, in 2020. They're struggling about what that looks like. So I definitely think it's possible, but one of the ways to do it, in my view, is to that Indigenous peoples need to be supported to do a lot of this work on their own, so they're in a position to be able to share it, and then you don't have those major power differences where it becomes possible to extract. So, for example, there's very few Indigenous climate policies in Canada. ITK has one. AFN should be releasing theirs shortly. Mostly what we're doing is inputting into other people's processes. So our knowledges are being assimilated in these processes all the time, right? But we're not really supported to kind of do our own thing so we can bring the whole knowledge system to the table in conversation with others. That doesn't happen a lot, and I think it needs to happen. Because communities have to be able to sort through a lot of this, but that requires, again, to one of my first points, is they need to be recognized as peoples and societies in order to do that. I should that paper. That one was a very cynical, because I was kind of, I had really high hopes, and they didn't quite deliver on it. So it was really frustrating. But since then, because I was actually involved in preparing writing a toolkit for the Chiefs of Ontario on impact assessment. and I had to write the traditional knowledge section of it. So of course I don't want to like depress the First Nations as we're training them. It's sort of like, this is where the hope lies. We need to be able to do this, so we're in a position to be able to share this in a way that that other folks who want to work with us and want to access our knowledge know how to do this appropriately. So I know that was a long-winded answer because it's something I think about all the time. Like how can we make that happen? Because we're calling for it. Certainly it's there in the rhetoric in a very abstract kind of way, but now we just sort of need to start making that making that a reality. So I kind of see hopes in the climate science 250 document, and also those glimmers of hopes. I'm glad there is at least an Indigenous knowledge policy framework. There wasn't one. At least people kind of know it's in the radar now and they need to think about this. But there's still a lot more work to build a capacity, among others, not just in Indigenous communities. So good question. I appreciate that. And yeah, thank you for reading the article. Hopefully you learned something from there other than my cynicism around this.
Do we have another question for Professor McGregor, either online or in person? And that was a great question.
Yeah. I just see something online.
Yes, we have one online.
Yeah, I think to answer that, it was actually in my notes. I recommend, if you haven't already, is to read Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a plant ecologist and grapples with a lot of these questions as well. It's a beautiful read. It's not one of those torturous reads. And I think, oh, someone said I've read it and love it because it was really interesting when she talks about like her career in science. How there I said Anishinaabeg have these different kind of questions. She went into science because her questions had to do with why is nature so beautiful? Why does the red and the yellow flowers, actually purple and yellow flowers go together? Why is it so beautiful? Those kind of questions were not approved of in her science program. So that would be one that I would recommend to read to get a sense of how different knowledges can work together. And I think it's helpful also to hear this from a scientist as well, how she deals with it in her own training, because she's operating in different knowledge systems as well. So thank you for that question. And someone also recommended gathering moss. Yeah.
Pardon me for the slight interruption. Stephanie's just going to repeat the question. I know we have the answer just for the audience here in the, we can't see the Zoom.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so the question was about having any recommendations of where to look or things to read to learn more about Indigenous knowledge sources and Indigenous science-related knowledge.
Stephanie, do we have another question from on Zoom, or are we?
I have another comment along these lines, and it is a recommendation to read Gathering Moss.
By the same author. Anything she does is great. Yeah. So I think my time's up. I really appreciate you, like this group, engaging with me, even though I'm, somewhere on screen and I'm not able to be there in person, which I would prefer. So I appreciate you spending this time with me, and I hope there's some gem in there that you can work with and gives you hope into the future in the work that you do.
There's an entire mine of gems, Professor McGregor, actually, an entire mine of them. I hope we're worthy of receiving them, actually. With that, thank you, Professor McGregor. I will conclude the session, and everybody here and everybody online actually can take themselves a break for about half an hour, and then we'll come back actually with a little bit of a session willing to indulge us both online and in person. We talk a little bit about sort of what next for, CASIOPA sort of more specifically, but generally speaking, we're looking at sort of research and approaches to protected areas and conservation in Ontario. Thank you, Professor McGregor, once again. And thank you for all the speakers today. I will sort of stop the share screen here as well. And for those on Zoom, actually, you'll see us actually pause the recording and we'll see a bit of a blank for a little while. We'll be back in half an hour. Thank you. recording in progress. So again, as I started out here, we've just finished off doing the Mentimeter. So for those of you watching in real time, you sort of participated in it. For those of you watching the recording, I didn't record it because it might be a little bit sort of much for you to watch that. It's a little more participatory, obviously, so you won't see that in the recording when you're watching this later. My very brief remarks again to start with are simply to thank all the presenters, to thank all those who participated on Zoom in and on during the day and in here in the classroom. We had an enormous number of students around participating, which is always sort of wonderful to see. Hopefully you got something out of this sort of topic and sort of get a chance to chat with a few people, especially even as we're leaving here today. So my appreciation to all of that. My appreciation to our technical crew. Thank you very much, you two, for helping us out here. Smoothing out any sort of, in the little wrinkles in there here. It actually worked out very well. My thanks to Stephanie Cruz-Masonette, who is our co-host, PhD student extraordinaire. And you'll see here actually sort of a future CASIOPA conference where she's going to be the star of the show. So I've already told you that. She's kind of, rolling her eyes for those of you on Zoom. You can't see that. It's true. My thanks to Jason Phoenix as well. Thanks, Jason, for coming in and helping us out. He's always sort of a good time and a good person to have around, actually, to sort of help us. He helped us sort of doing the facilitation of the question and answer session. With that, colleagues, I'm going to conclude this. For those of you on Zoom, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much in the classroom. We hope to see you at a future workshop or webinar, and certainly hope to see you actually at a future CASIOPA conference. Thank you.